I am Vivian Thorne, 35 years old, and last Sunday my parents demanded I hand over $400,000 to save my brother from his own greed. When I calmly refused, my father looked me dead in the eye, pointed at the front door, and told me I was no longer his daughter. My mother did not even blink. She just kept eating her pot roast. They thought they had issued the ultimate punishment. They assumed I would walk out to my car, sob over the steering wheel, and wire the funds by Monday morning out of desperate guilt. What they did not know, what they could never have anticipated, was that a few hours later I would receive a late-night call from my underwriters. The bank I run had just acquired a portfolio of distressed commercial loans, and my brother's name was at the very top of the ledger. They thought they were cutting me off. They did not realize they had just handed me the blade. Before I tell you exactly how they ended up begging in my glass lobby the next morning, if you have ever had a family treat you like an ATM, subscribe to Sophia Vengeance. Drop a comment below. How old are you, and have you ever had to walk away from your own blood reason? Now let me take you into the dining room, where the illusion of my family shattered for good. The air inside my parents' house felt thick, heavy with the smell of braised beef and unearned arrogance. We lived in different worlds, though separated by only a 2-hour drive. They stayed in their quiet Illinois prairie town, a place where family loyalty was traded like currency, while I lived under the steel and glass shadow of Chicago. I visited once a month. I always brought an expensive bottle of wine. They always served it in cheap glasses. My brother Leo sat across from me at the heavy mahogany table. He was 38. He wore a crisp linen shirt and a watch that cost more than my first car. For the past decade, my parents had treated him like a visionary. They leveraged their retirement to send him to a private, elite university, bragging to the neighbors about his brilliant future. When he started a luxury logistics company, they hosted a catered launch party. I paid for my own state college tuition by working double shifts at a diner. When I passed my licensing exams and climbed the corporate ladder, my mother sent a text with a thumbs-up emoji. That Sunday, Leo was not his usual boastful self. His golf tan looked sallow under the dining room chandelier. He pushed a piece of carrots around his plate, refusing to meet my eyes. "I messed up," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My father, Richard, leaned forward. "What do you mean you messed up?" Leo swallowed hard. "The business, the loans. I am in default. They are calling the note." The room went silent. The grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick louder. "How much, Leo?" I asked. He looked at his plate. 400,000. My mother, Brenda, did not gasp. She did not yell at the son who had just admitted to squandering nearly $500,000 of borrowed money. Instead, she picked up the porcelain gravy boat, poured a generous spoonful over her roast, and turned her head to look directly at me. "Well, Vivian," she said. Her voice was smooth, carrying the casual expectation of someone asking me to pass the salt. "You make good money doing whatever it is you do at that bank of yours. You need to write a check." I stared at her. The sheer audacity of the demand sat between us like a physical object on the table. "I am not writing a check for $400,000, I said. My voice remained level. Leo finally looked up. "Come on, Viv. You have the cash. I know you do. You do not even have a family to support. I have Jessica and the kids. If I lose the business, we lose the house." "You leased 3 European SUVs in a single year," I said. "You took Jessica to Aspen in February. You paid country club dues while your accounts receivable bled dry. This is not a stroke of bad luck, Leo. This is gross negligence." My father dropped his fork. It hit the china plate with a sharp clatter. "Do not speak to your brother that way," Richard snapped. "He is an entrepreneur. He takes risks. You sit at a desk and shuffle papers. You have no idea the pressure he is under." I looked at the man who raised me. He genuinely believed it. He believed Leo was a misunderstood genius and I was just a glorified clerical worker hoarding unearned wealth. They had no concept of my actual life. They did not know I was the regional director of Midwest Central Bank. They did not know I managed a multi-billion-dollar portfolio or that older seasoned executives deferred to my judgment every single day. "I am not bailing him out," I said. I folded my hands in my lap. "I will not drain my savings to fund his vanity projects." Brenda sighed a long, martyred sound. "Vivian, do not be selfish. We are family. We take care of our own. You have always been so rigid. Just call your little bank tomorrow, pull the funds, and we can put this ugly business behind us." "No." The word hung there, short, final. Richard stood up. His chair scraped against the hardwood floor. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You listen to me," he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. "We gave you everything. We put a roof over your head, we clothed you, and now, when your own flesh and blood needs a lifeline, you sit there and count your pennies." "I paid rent the day I turned 18, I reminded him quietly. "You pay this debt," Richard said, ignoring me entirely. "You pay this debt or you walk out that door and you do not ever come back. You are not our daughter anymore." The silence returned heavier this time. I looked at Leo. He was staring at the table, letting our father do his dirty work, just like he always did. I looked at my mother. She was cutting her meat, chewing slowly, waiting for me to break. They expected tears. They expected an apology. They expected the dutiful, forgotten daughter to panic at the thought of losing the only family she had. I felt a strange, sudden lightness in my chest. The obligation I had carried for 35 years simply evaporated. I stood up. I picked up my linen napkin, folded it into a perfect square, and placed it beside my plate. I picked up my purse from the floor. "Good luck, Leo," I said. I turned and walked down the hallway. I opened the front door and stepped out into the humid evening air. "Vivian," my father shouted from the dining room, "if you leave, you are dead to us." I shut the door behind me. The click of the lock sounded like a chain breaking. I walked down the driveway to my car, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the concrete. I did not shed a single tear. I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the house I would never enter again. The drive back to Chicago took 2 hours. The highway stretched out ahead of me, dark and empty. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. 6 texts from my mother, 4 from Leo. I ignored them all. I watched the skyline appear on the horizon, the buildings glowing like embers against the night sky. I thought the worst part of the night was over. I thought the confrontation at the dinner table was the end of the story. I was wrong. The story had not even started. Because at 2 a.m, my phone was going to ring, and the voice on the other end was going to hand me the exact weapon my family dared me to use. The highway lines blurred into a steady, hypnotic rhythm as I drove north. Interstate 55 stretched out ahead, carrying me away from the suffocating humidity of my parents' dining room. My phone sat in the center console. The screen flared to life every few miles, casting a harsh, pale glow across the dark cabin of my car. A sharp chime broke the silence again and again. Leo was texting. I did not touch the device. I let it ring. I let the notifications stack up a digital monument to his panic. "You are throwing a tantrum, Viv." That was the first message I caught a glimpse of when I slowed down for a construction zone. Dad did not mean what he said. "Just calm down and call me tomorrow." He thought this was a negotiation. He assumed my departure was a theatrical exit, a temporary flare of rebellion from the reliable, quiet sister. He genuinely believed that by sunrise, the natural order of our family would restore itself. I pressed the accelerator. The engine hummed a low, powerful vibration beneath my feet, propelling me closer to the city. I thought about the natural order of our family. I thought about a sweltering July afternoon 19 years ago. I was 16, soaking my blistered feet in a plastic tub of Epsom salts after a 10-hour shift waitressing at the local diner. I smelled like fryer grease and bleach. I was saving every dime for my own prom dress and a deposit for my college dorm. My mother stood in the kitchen and told me that honest, grueling work builds character. An hour later, my father walked into the house, jangling a set of keys. He tossed them to Leo. Outside in the driveway sat a brand new midnight blue Ford truck. For me, character was built on minimum wage. For the golden boy, confidence was built on a $40,000 gift. Another chime lit up the console. "Jessica is crying. The kids are going to lose their home. How can you be so cold?" Jessica, my sister-in-law. The logistics company Leo started was supposed to be a freight forwarding firm. It is a gritty, margin-tight industry that requires lean operations and relentless discipline. Leo ran it like a tech startup in Silicon Valley. He rented a downtown loft office with exposed brick and imported espresso machines. Jessica insisted his image needed to project elite success to attract elite clients. She documented their entire lives on social media. She posted unboxing videos of designer handbags, tagging them with CEO Wife Life. They leased a Range Rover for her grocery runs and a Porsche Cayenne for his client lunches. They joined the Oak Creek Country Club, a place where the initiation fees cost more than my first year of law school. They did not build a successful business. They built a pristine lifestyle aesthetic and built it all to a commercial line of credit. Leo did not fall victim to a bad economy. He bled his own company dry to fund an illusion. The skyline of Chicago began to rise in the distance. The towering structures stood like dark monoliths against the night sky, their peaks outlined by aviation lights. The closer I got to the city, the easier it was to breathe. A new message flashed on the screen. "We are family, Vivian. You are acting like a traitor." Traitor. The word echoed in the quiet space of my car. To be a traitor, you have to owe allegiance to a crown. My parents treated Leo like royalty. They worshipped his elite private university degree. When he graduated in Boston, they flew first class. They booked a corner suite at a luxury hotel, celebrating his degree like a sacred artifact that would change the world. When I finished my dual master degrees in finance and corporate law, graduating top of my class in Chicago, they drove up for the afternoon. My mother complained about the city traffic and the cost of parking. My father checked his watch through the entire commencement ceremony. They left before the reception because they had tickets to a local charity gala back home. My diplomas are framed in museum glass in my office. My parents have never laid eyes on them. My phone buzzed again this time, with a notification from Facebook. Jessica had tagged me in a post. I did not click on the application, but the preview text crawled across my locked screen. Family is supposed to be your anchor in the storm. Heartbroken to learn that some people care more about their bank accounts than their own nieces and nephews. She was already laying the groundwork. She was weaponizing the grounded family-first values of our surrounding prairie towns against me. In their community, blood loyalty superseded everything. You bailed out your relatives no matter the cost, no matter the personal ruin. Jessica knew exactly how to play the victim to the local audience. She wanted the neighbors to view me as the cold corporate villain who turned her back on a hard-working family man. She wanted to shame me into submission. What Jessica failed to realize was that I did not live in their community. I operated in a world governed by contracts, collateral, and severe financial consequences. The unyielding realities of Illinois corporate finance did not care about Facebook likes or tearful neighborhood gossip. I passed the city limits. The rural darkness gave way to the harsh, brilliant glow of streetlights and neon. I navigated the familiar grid of the downtown streets, feeling the rhythm of the city seep into my bones. I pulled into the secure underground garage of my condominium building. The heavy steel gate rolled shut behind me, sealing out the noise of the outside world. I parked in my reserved spot. The concrete walls were quiet, cool, and pristine. I finally picked up the phone. 12 messages from Leo, 8 from my mother. My mother's texts were different. They did not plead, they commanded. "Your brother is under immense stress. You will wire the funds on Monday. We can discuss an apology for your behavior at Thanksgiving." I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the leather steering wheel. I read the words carefully, analyzing the subtext. They genuinely believed my boundaries were an illusion. They thought the obedient safety net would inevitably stretch to catch them. They relied on the old script, the one where I shrink, apologize, and open my wallet to buy my way back into their good graces. I swiped the notifications away. I did not block their numbers yet. I wanted the record. In corporate finance, you always keep the paper trail. I stepped out of the car. The echo of my heels on the polished concrete sounded like a gavel dropping. I walked to the private elevator, swiped my security badge, and the doors slid open. I rode up to the 34th floor. My penthouse apartment was silent. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over Lake Michigan and the glowing curves of Millennium Park. The water was a black expanse, vast and indifferent. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water. I stood by the glass, looking down at the scattered headlights far below. I felt a profound sense of detachment. I was not angry anymore. Anger requires an expectation of better behavior. I expected nothing from them. They played their final card at the dining table. They severed the tie to use it as leverage, assuming the threat of abandonment would break my resolve. They did not understand that leverage only works if the target is afraid of being alone. I was not afraid. I had built a fortress out of sheer competence and unyielding discipline. I did not need their permission to exist, and I certainly did not need their approval to thrive. I placed the glass on the marble kitchen island. I needed sleep. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow I would step back into my role as the regional director of Midwest Central Bank. Tomorrow I had a morning briefing on the distressed asset portfolios my acquisition team secured last Friday. I walked toward my bedroom, unbuttoning the cuffs of my silk blouse. I was ready to close the chapter on my family. I was ready to let Leo face the consequences of the shallow pool he dug for himself. Somewhere in a prairie town, my brother was pacing his hardwood floors, telling his crying wife that his sister would fix it. He was telling her that I always caved when the pressure got high enough. He was likely drafting his next demanding text message, secure in his delusion that Monday morning would bring a wire transfer. Let him type. Let him pace. Let them all sleep soundly tonight, dreaming of my compliance. Because when the sun rose, they were going to learn that the obedient daughter they thought they could manipulate had been replaced by a woman who holds all the cards. The social conflict they thought they won in a dining room was about to be obliterated by the cold reality of my boardroom. Monday morning arrived with the sterile, unforgiving precision of a Swiss watch. I stepped out of my town car and walked through the soaring glass atrium of the Midwest Central Bank Tower. The air inside the lobby was climate-controlled to a crisp 68 degrees, smelling faintly of expensive ozone and polished steel. My Italian leather heels struck the imported marble floor in a sharp, rhythmic cadence. The sound echoed through the cavernous space, acting as a herald of my arrival. Men in tailored charcoal suits stepped aside. Two senior vice presidents executives who had spent decades climbing the corporate ladder offered deferential nods as I passed. "Good morning, Miss Thorne," they murmured, almost in unison. I offered a brief, polite inclination of my head, never breaking my stride. I stepped into the private executive elevator and swiped my encrypted security badge. The doors glided shut, sealing me inside a silent, ascending metal vault. I rode up to the 42nd floor. The heavy mahogany double doors of my executive suite stood open, revealing a room bordered by floor-to-ceiling glass. The view offered a sweeping, uninterrupted panorama of the Chicago skyline. Far below, the morning sun reflected brilliantly off the polished metal curves of Cloud Gate. The iconic structure looked like a drop of liquid mercury, perfectly mirroring the cold, unyielding reality of the financial empire I controlled. I set my briefcase on my desk, running a hand over the cool surface. My parents genuinely believed I was a mid-level branch manager. They pictured me sitting in a beige cubicle, approving small auto loans and managing teller schedules. To them, my success was a cute, modest achievement useful only when Leo needed a safety net. They possessed zero comprehension of the corporate titan I had become. As the newly appointed regional director, I oversaw a commercial portfolio worth over $7 billion. I commanded a division of 200 financial analysts, corporate attorneys, and risk assessors. My signature authorized capital allocations that built high-rise developments and acquired smaller financial institutions. Their ignorance was deliberate. It was rooted in a deeply ingrained, toxic favoritism. Growing up, they practically worshipped the ground Leo walked on because he was accepted into a prestigious elite university on the East Coast. They leveraged their retirement to pay his exorbitant tuition, treating his mediocre business degree like a sacred relic. They believed his pedigree made him a visionary. Meanwhile, they treated my graduation from a top-tier corporate law program in Chicago like a trivial afterthought. When I passed the bar exam with the highest percentile in the state, my father told me that being a lawyer was a reliable backup plan for a woman. They obsessed over prestige, but only when it belonged to their son. They did not understand that in the relentless machinery of corporate Illinois, pedigree meant nothing without execution. And I executed flawlessly. My executive assistant walked in quietly, placing a ceramic cup of black coffee and a thick, leather-bound dossier on my desk. "The 10 o'clock risk assessment meeting is prepped," she said, her tone professional and brisk. "David and the underwriting team are waiting in boardroom B." I thanked her, took a sip of the bitter coffee, and picked up the dossier. Late Friday afternoon, the bank had executed a rapid acquisition, swallowing up a struggling regional credit union that serviced the outer prairie towns. It was a strategic move to absorb their commercial real estate holdings, but acquisitions of that nature always carried dead weight. I walked down the hall to the boardroom. The room fell dead silent the moment I crossed the threshold. 12 of the sharpest financial minds in the state stopped their side conversations and opened their laptops. I took my seat at the head of the long oak table, placing my dossier in front of me. David, my chief risk officer, stood at the far end of the room. He projected a dense spreadsheet onto the digital wall monitor. He looked uncharacteristically tense, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses before pointing to a section of data highlighted in glaring red. Vivian, we are digging through the distressed asset portfolio we absorbed in the buyout David began. The commercial loans bundled in Sector 4 are a disaster. The previous bank handed out lines of credit like candy to local businesses based on hometown relationships rather than actual verified collateral. We are looking at dozens of defaulted notes. The underwriting is incredibly sloppy. I stared at the red lines on the screen. I felt no sympathy for the failing businesses. In my world, numbers did not lie, and incompetence was not a protected class. I thought about the culture of those small towns where a firm handshake at the country club and a familiar last name could secure a $500,000 loan without a proper background check. I detested that culture. I had spent my entire life outworking the very people who coasted on unearned privileges. "What is our total exposure?" I asked, my voice cutting through the quiet hum of the ventilation system. David scrolled down the document. Across 40 accounts, we are holding roughly $18 million in outstanding defaulted debt. Most of them are limited liability companies that have been delinquent for over 90 days. The previous bank kept extending their grace periods, hoping the borrowers would magically turn their profit margins around. They wanted to avoid triggering foreclosures and upsetting the local community. David paused, leaning his hands on the table. "Some of these are family-owned ventures, Vivian, long-standing pillars of their towns. Taking stern action will cause a significant ripple effect out there. Should we consider offering settlement structures or extended payment plans to soften the blow?" "We do not offer settlement structures to negligent borrowers," I said, my tone stripping the warmth from the room. "We are a commercial lender, David, not a charitable foundation." I looked around the table, ensuring every analyst and underwriter met my gaze. "I want a zero-tolerance audit on Sector 4. Freeze every delinquent account. Initiate immediate asset reviews and pass the worst offenders directly to our litigation department. Call the notes. If they signed a contract they could not fulfill, they will face the consequences." David nodded, abandoning his request for leniency. He typed rapidly on his keyboard. "You want us to fast-track the foreclosures on the defaulted commercial properties?" "Yes," I replied, leaning back in my leather chair. "If they cannot service their debt, we will liquidate their collateral. Prepare the authorization forms and bring them to my office." The meeting adjourned. 10 minutes later, David stood in my office, sliding a dense stack of legal documents across my glass desk. The paperwork was filled with boilerplate corporate terminology authorizing Midwest Central Bank to legally seize the assets of the defaulted accounts. I picked up my silver fountain pen. The metal felt cool and heavy in my grip. I did not flip to the appendix to read the individual names of the failing businesses. I did not care who they were or what their stories entailed. I signed my name on the dotted line with swift, fluid strokes, the ink bleeding dark into the crisp white paper. I handed the stack back to David. "Execute the freezes immediately," I ordered. David took the documents and left the room, the heavy doors closing softly behind him. I walked back to the glass wall, looking out over the sprawling city, feeling the deep, resonant hum of institutional power vibrating beneath my feet. I had just initiated a ruthless financial purge across the outer suburbs, acting with cold, detached precision. I was entirely unaware of the ticking time bomb I had just armed. I had no idea that buried deep inside that thick stack of authorized foreclosures was a luxury logistics company registered under my brother's name. I had just signed the exact legal mechanism required to obliterate Leo and his pristine, fraudulent lifestyle. The machinery of my bank was already moving, locking onto his assets, preparing to strip him of everything he owned, and it was only a matter of time before the shockwave reached my parents' front door. Sleep is a rare and fragile commodity in the world of commercial banking. The digital clock resting on the nightstand beside my bed glowed a faint, clinical white. 2 a.m. on a Wednesday. The sprawling city of Chicago never truly sleeps, but at this particular hour, the restless hum of traffic far below my window was reduced to a low, rhythmic whisper. I was deep in a dreamless rest when the sharp, jarring ring of my secure corporate cell phone shattered the quiet of the penthouse. I did not grope blindly for the device in the dark. I sat up alert instantly, my mind already cycling through the complex variables of global markets, overseas portfolio shifts, and domestic interest rate fluctuations. Only Tier 1 corporate emergencies bypass the strict silent mode programmed into that specific phone. I reached out and picked up the receiver. The caller identification screen cast a harsh light across the room, displaying the name David, my chief risk officer. "Vivian, I apologize for the hour," David said. His voice sounded tight, carrying the distinct, gravelly exhaustion of a man who had been staring at glowing spreadsheets since sunrise. "We hit a critical anomaly in the distressed asset audit." "Define anomaly," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, betraying none of the heavy fog of interrupted sleep. "I stayed late to finalize the freeze orders you authorized on Monday afternoon," he continued, the rapid percussive clicking of a keyboard echoing through the receiver. "We ran the final compliance checks on the Sector 4 defaults, verifying the legal entities before initiating the asset seizures. The automated underwriting system triggered a severe red flag on a specific commercial account. It is a Class A conflict of interest alert tied directly to your executive personnel file." I pushed the heavy down duvet aside. The polished hardwood floor felt like ice against my bare feet as I stood up and walked out of the bedroom, moving into the expansive, darkened living room. The skyline stood silent outside the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, a sea of glittering diamonds suspended in the dark. "Give me the LLC name," I instructed. David hesitated. In the high-stakes arena of corporate finance, navigating the personal liabilities of a superior is a dangerous, unpredictable tightrope. "Vanguard Medical Logistics," he said cautiously. "The primary guarantor listed on the original promissory note is a Leonard Thorne. The residential address matches a property in your hometown." I stopped walking. The silence in the penthouse stretched thick and suffocating. Leo, my brother, the golden boy who had squandered his unearned pedestal staring at his shoes and crying over a plate of pot roast just 3 days prior. "I am logging into the secure server now," I told David. I walked into my home office, a minimalist sanctuary dominated by a sleek walnut desk and minimal distractions. I opened my encrypted laptop. The screen flared to life, the brilliant blue light cutting through the shadows and illuminating my face. The glow reflected in the dark glass of the window, casting a pale, ghostly mask over my features. I typed my long, complex alphanumeric credentials, my fingers moving with rapid, practiced precision. I bypassed the standard firewalls, accessed the distressed debt portal, and pulled up the Vanguard Medical Logistics file. The financial data populated the screen, crisp, structured, and entirely undeniable. There it was, sitting in the liabilities column, the exact figure that had hung like a guillotine over my parents' dining table. $400,000 in immediate default. I leaned closer to the screen, reading the origin documents like a forensic investigator dissecting a crime scene. I needed to understand the exact anatomy of his failure. Leo had leveraged his elite background to secure the initial commercial note with a small provincial bank in his prairie town. My parents had spent decades worshiping his expensive private university medical management degree. They bought him business-class flights and treated him to Michelin-starred dinners to celebrate his supposed genius, treating my prestigious corporate law degree like a trivial afterthought. They believed his pedigree made him untouchable. But that small, prestige-obsessed town bank had run into a severe liquidity crunch. Desperate to clear their own toxic liabilities before an upcoming federal audit, the provincial lenders had bundled his failing loan with dozens of other terrible bets. They sold the entire distressed portfolio at a steep discount to Midwest Central Bank, offloading their trash to our institution to salvage whatever pennies on the dollar they could. The bitter, exquisite irony washed over me, a cold wave of realization. When my parents demanded I write a personal check to save my brother from his creditors, they had no earthly idea they were looking at the creditor. Midwest Central Bank owned the debt, which meant, by direct extension of my executive authority, I owned my brother's entire financial existence. I scrolled through the default notices, watching the late fees and penalty rates accumulating like barnacles on a sinking ship. He had broken 3 separate debt service covenants. The file detailed reckless corporate spending, funds diverted to sustain an opulent lifestyle rather than stabilizing the core business operations. They thought True Power was a firm handshake at a local country club and an elite piece of paper hanging on a wall. They were about to learn that True Power was holding the legal deed to your opponent's life in the palm of your hand, backed by the largest, most unyielding commercial lender in the state of Illinois. Vivian David said, breaking the heavy silence on the line, "The compliance protocols are rigid in these scenarios. Given the immediate familial relation, I need to ask you formally, do you want to recuse yourself from this specific asset recovery? I can transfer the Vanguard file to a secondary regional director to avoid any perceived bias or ethical complications." He was offering me an exit door. He naturally assumed I would want to distance myself to protect my brother from the ruthless grinding machinery of our collections department. Or perhaps, deep down, he feared I would attempt to sweep the debt under the rug quietly, reclassifying the $400,000 as an unrecoverable loss to save my family the public humiliation of bankruptcy. I stared at the glowing screen. I saw the itemized list of leased luxury vehicles, the exorbitant country club dues paid with borrowed corporate funds, the fraudulent aesthetic of success financed entirely by deceit. I remembered my father standing up at the dinner table, his face red with indignation, pointing a trembling finger at the door and telling me I was dead to them. I remembered my mother casually pouring gravy, expecting me to empty my life savings to shield her favorite child from his own blinding incompetence. They severed the ties, they established the rules of engagement. I was simply going to enforce the contract. "No, David," I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure, uncompromising ice. "I will not recuse myself." I heard a faint, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "We are going to pursue this collection with the strictest adherence to corporate policy," I continued, my eyes tracking the digitized signatures on the loan agreement, hovering over my brother's frantic handwriting. "There will be no favors, there will be no unrecorded extensions, and there will be no settlement negotiations. You will process Vanguard Medical Logistics exactly as you would any other hostile default. Flag the accounts for immediate asset seizure." "Understood," David replied, his initial hesitation vanishing, replaced instantly by crisp institutional professionalism. "I will authorize the legal department to draft the formal foreclosure and freeze notices by morning." "Ensure the notices are sent via certified courier," I instructed. "I want the delivery legally logged the exact second the envelope reaches his hands." I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the walnut desk. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, letting the deep silence of the apartment envelop me once more. The blue light of the monitor continued to paint my face a digital campfire burning in the dark. The trap was officially set. The steel jaws were locked open, waiting for the inevitable misstep. I closed the laptop. The screen went black, plunging the room back into total darkness. I walked back to the window and looked out at the sprawling, sleeping city below. My family truly thought they had exiled me. They believed their dramatic rejection was the ultimate punishment, isolating me from the warmth of their conditional love. They felt safe in their rural bubble, secure in their delusion that blood loyalty would eventually force me to capitulate and beg for their forgiveness. They were about to discover the terrifying reality of the world I commanded. By sunrise, the certified corporate letters would leave the Chicago mailing center, speeding toward the prairie town they thought insulated them from consequence. The legal mechanisms of commercial asset forfeiture do not care about a mother's manipulative tears or a father's empty theatrical threats. My brother's wife, Jessica, was likely asleep in her oversized suburban home right now, dreaming of her next country club luncheon, completely unaware that the foundation of her pristine life had just been legally demolished. When the panic inevitably set in, she would not turn to quiet reflection or accountability. People like Jessica only knew how to escalate. She was going to try to shame me into submission, preparing a calculated public ambush that would soon bring her manufactured war directly to my front door. Wednesday bled into Thursday with the predictable rhythmic tempo of a digital witch hunt. My phone vibrated incessantly against my glass desk while I reviewed quarterly earnings reports. The notifications were not corporate emails. They were social media alerts. Jessica had taken her grievances public. During my lunch hour, I opened the application to observe her strategy. She had gone live on Facebook, broadcasting directly to the insular, gossip-hungry community of our hometown. The video was a masterclass in suburban manipulation. Jessica sat on the imported marble island of her pristine, oversized kitchen, wearing a beige cashmere sweater, clutching a mug of tea with both hands. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her makeup carefully smudged to convey exhaustion without sacrificing her aesthetic. Sometimes she told the camera, her voice thick with rehearsed sorrow. The people you share blood with are the first to walk away when the storm hits. It breaks my heart to see how money changes people. Leo has worked so hard for this family, and to be abandoned in our hour of need is just devastating. She did not mention the $400,000 deficit. She did not mention the leased luxury vehicles, the country club initiation fees, or the extravagant vacations financed by borrowed capital. She painted a compelling, entirely fictional portrait of a hard-working father crushed by a cruel, wealthy sister who refused to throw down a simple life preserver. The comments flooded in a chorus of enabling sympathy from neighbors and extended relatives. Within an hour, the text messages began to infiltrate my personal phone. Aunt Carol sent a long paragraph detailing how disappointed my late grandmother would be. Cousin Greg demanded I drive back to the prairie and apologize to my father for my unprecedented disrespect. They lived in a bubble where holding a financial boundary was treated as a cardinal sin. In their world, enabling bad behavior was rebranded as familial loyalty. I did not type a single reply. I opened the settings menu and muted the entire group chat, silencing the notifications for every relative who felt entitled to my bank account. Silence was the most effective shield against manufactured hysteria. I spent the remainder of my Thursday finalizing capital allocation audits, letting their provincial outrage scream into the void of my filtered inbox. The sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete canyons of the city. I left the bank and drove home, pulling my car into the secure underground garage of my condominium. The lobby of my building is a study in brutalist elegance: slate floors, brushed steel columns, and towering floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the river. Security is typically impenetrable, requiring a key fob and facial recognition to pass the outer vestibule. But as I walked toward the private residential elevators, Marcus, the evening concierge, caught my eye. He stood behind his polished stone desk, giving me a subtle, apologetic nod toward the guest seating area. I turned my head. Jessica sat on a low, modern leather sofa. She looked distinctly out of place, an invader from the suburbs stranded in a sleek, minimalist fortress. Her status-obsessed aesthetic clashed violently with the austere architecture of the lobby. She wore a tailored trench coat, clutching a quilted designer handbag against her chest like a shield. She had likely tailgated a delivery driver through the outer security gate, bypassing the front desk protocols. When she saw me approach, she leaped to her feet. The performance began before I even came within arm's reach. "Vivian, please!" she cried out, her voice echoing sharply off the slate walls. She tried to close the distance, reaching out with manicured hands to grasp my forearm. I took a deliberate, measured half-step backward, keeping my hands resting smoothly at my sides. The physical rejection halted her momentum instantly. "How did you get in here, Jessica?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level, devoid of any emotional traction she could latch onto. She ignored the boundary, pressing forward with her theatrical desperation. "We need to talk. You will not answer your phone. Your mother is sick with worry. Leo has not slept in 3 days. You have to help us." Her eyes were wide, brimming with tears she had clearly summoned for the occasion. It was the same expression she used in her social media broadcast, deployed now in person for maximum guilt. "I told you at Sunday dinner," I said, my voice echoing cold in the cavernous lobby. "My answer, no." Jessica let a single tear roll down her cheek, tracking a slow path through her flawless foundation. "It is not just about Leo," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What about the children? What about your own nieces and nephews? If the creditors take the house, we will have nowhere to go. How can you sleep at night knowing those innocent kids might lose their home because you were too stubborn to write a check?" She was playing the ultimate trump card, the innocent children. It was the exact tactic that always worked on my parents, forcing them to open their wallets without a second thought, to shield the grandchildren from discomfort. I looked at the quilted leather handbag clutched in her fingers. The interlocking logo caught the ambient light of the lobby. It retailed for roughly $4,000. If you are truly worried about keeping a roof over your children, I said, maintaining steady, unflinching eye contact, I suggest you sell the bag. Sell the Range Rover. Cancel the country club membership you renewed last month. You are not facing homelessness, Jessica. You are facing a downgrade in your lifestyle, and you want me to subsidize your luxury. The tears stopped instantly. The sorrow in her eyes hardened into something sharp, brittle, and vicious. The weeping mother vanished, replaced by the entitled socialite who was furious at being denied her customary bailout. "You do not understand how business works," she hissed, her voice dropping the theatrical sorrow. "Leo needs that image to secure elite clients. You sit in your corporate tower collecting a steady salary. You do not know what it takes to build an empire from scratch. You just push papers." The irony was so profound it nearly made me smile. She was standing in the lobby of a high-rise, lecturing the regional director of the state's most powerful commercial lender on the mechanics of building an empire. She genuinely believed her husband's crumbling logistics firm was a titan of industry, and I was just an ignorant, stingy employee who did not grasp the nuances of high finance. "I understand exactly how business works," I replied, stepping slightly closer, letting the sheer weight of my authority press down on her. "I understand that when you sign a commercial promissory note, you are legally bound to repay the principal. I understand that defaulting on a six-figure loan carries severe, unavoidable consequences." She scoffed, crossing her arms defensively over her trench coat. "It is a temporary cash flow problem. We just need a bridge loan from you until the original bank backs off. They are a small-town branch. Leo can talk them down." I looked directly into her eyes, holding her gaze until she shifted her weight uncomfortably. "Emotional blackmail will not pay off a commercial note, Jessica." The mask shattered entirely. Her face turned a mottled, furious shade of red. The realization that her tears, her guilt trips, and her children were entirely ineffective struck her like a physical blow. "You are a monster," she spat, her voice escalating into a shrill echo that caused the concierge to glance in our direction. "You are a cold, unfeeling monster. Your father was right to disown you. You do not deserve a family." She turned on her heel, her designer boots striking the slate floor in a rapid, angry retreat. I stood perfectly still, watching her march out through the revolving glass doors, disappearing into the cool Chicago night. She thought her words had cut me. She thought she had delivered a devastating psychological blow, leaving me isolated and condemned in my empty glass tower. But as the revolving doors spun to a halt, a profound, serene satisfaction settled over my shoulders. She had no idea that her theatrical ambush was entirely meaningless. She had no idea that while she was weeping in my lobby, the automated mailing system at Midwest Central Bank had already printed the certified foreclosure notices. The legal storm was currently sitting in a sorting facility, waiting to be loaded onto a delivery truck by dawn. Jessica could scream, cry, and post all the videos she wanted, but tomorrow morning the postman would require a signature, and the illusion she fought so desperately to protect was going to burn to the ground. I turned toward the elevators, ready to head up to my office and review the paper trail that would dismantle their lies piece by piece. Friday morning brought a steady, unrelenting rain that lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of my office. The Chicago skyline was swallowed by a thick gray mist, reducing the towering skyscrapers to faint silhouettes. Inside my suite, the environment remained perfectly calibrated. The air was cool, smelling faintly of leather and ozone. I sat behind my walnut desk, the city stretched out below me, and opened the thick physical dossier the underwriting department had prepared. The digital files were efficient, but for an execution of this magnitude, I requested the hard copies. I wanted to feel the weight of the paper in my hands. The stark black and white reality of bank statements presents a striking contrast to the colorful, dramatic lies my family spun. Jessica could weep in a lobby, and my father could shout over a dining table, but ink and paper held no emotion. A ledger does not care about your golf handicap, your curated social media presence, or your local reputation. It only records the truth, and the truth sitting on my desk was devastating. I began tracing the outflow of capital, acting as a forensic auditor dissecting a long-forgotten crime scene. Leo always claimed his logistics firm suffered from a sluggish economy and delayed shipping contracts. He blamed vendors. He blamed inflation. The audit painted a far more sinister picture. My brother was not a victim of macroeconomic trends. He was bleeding the corporate line of credit to sustain an opulent personal life. I ran my index finger down the columns of withdrawn funds, matching dates and vendor identification numbers. I noted a $50,000 wire transfer logged in the system as facility upgrades. I cross-referenced the receiving vendor. It was not a commercial warehouse supplier. It was a high-end residential contractor. Leo had used business capital to install the imported marble kitchen island where Jessica sat weeping during her suburban social media broadcast. I turned the page. Another $30,000 was funneled to an elite private academy for their children, categorized fraudulently in the ledger as executive training seminars. Then came the winter expenses: 7 nights in Aspen, chartered flights and luxury ski resort lodging, all billed to a corporate expense account right before he missed his first quarterly payment. He was withdrawing cash advances against the business to pay the monthly lease on Jessica's Range Rover. This was not entrepreneurial failure. This was deliberate theft. By commingling his personal expenses with his commercial accounts, Leo had committed a severe breach of contract. In the realm of corporate law, this behavior pierced the corporate veil. It meant his limited liability company could no longer shield him. He was personally responsible for every single cent. I felt a cold, calculating calm wash over me. The deeper I dug into the file, the more the illusion of the golden boy disintegrated. My parents had worshipped his brilliance while he secretly financed his entire existence on stolen time and borrowed money. But the final revelation, the true depth of the catastrophe, was buried in the collateral agreements near the back of the folder. A commercial note of that size, especially one extended to a high-risk borrower with erratic cash flow, required ironclad backing. I scanned the collateral schedules, expecting to see a warehouse lease or a fleet of commercial freight trucks pledged against the debt. Instead, my eyes locked onto a residential property deed. The address etched onto the legal document was burned into my memory. It was the house with the wraparound porch in the prairie town. It was the same house where I grew up, the same dining room where I was told to leave and never return. I read the addendum twice to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. 2 years ago, when Leo needed a crucial credit extension to keep his sinking ship afloat, the provincial bank demanded a guarantor. His business assets were already stretched too thin. He needed someone with unencumbered wealth to co-sign the note. My parents had stepped in. They pledged the deed to their fully paid-off home. They signed their names on the dotted line, tying their entire retirement security to his fraudulent enterprise. A brief, suffocating tightness gripped my chest. For a fleeting second, the ghost of the obedient, dutiful daughter surfaced. I pictured my mother tending to her pristine garden in the backyard. I pictured my father sitting in his favorite leather armchair by the fireplace. Executing this foreclosure meant taking that away from them. It meant initiating the legal process that would evict them from the only home they had known for 4 decades. The sheer weight of that decision hovered over me, heavy and suffocating. Society conditions us to protect our parents, to shield them from ruin, regardless of their transgressions. Then the memory of Sunday evening returned, vivid and razor-sharp. I saw my father standing up, his face flushed with unearned righteous indignation. I heard his voice echoing in the dining room, stripping me of my title as his child, simply because I refused to be their financial shield. I saw my mother pouring gravy over her roast, entirely indifferent to my sacrifice, expecting me to empty my savings to cover the losses. They had wagered their shelter on a son who stole from them to buy designer handbags and ski trips. When the gamble failed, they tried to force me to cover the catastrophic loss, threatening me with exile when I refused. The ghost of the dutiful daughter vanished crushed under the crushing weight of their hypocrisy. They made their choice. They signed a contract. I reached for my silver fountain pen. The hesitation evaporated, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. I signed the authorization forms. My signature flowed across the paper, sharp and definitive. I authorized the immediate asset freeze for Vanguard Medical Logistics. I authorized the personal asset seizure for Leonard Thorne. And finally, I signed the foreclosure initiation for the residential collateral belonging to Richard and Brenda Thorne. I pressed a button on my desk console. A moment later, Vance, the senior legal counsel for Midwest Central Bank, stepped into my office. He was an imposing, quiet man who moved with the deliberate grace of a seasoned litigator. I slid the heavy dossier across the glass desk. "The audit is complete," I said, keeping my voice devoid of any inflection. "The borrower has pierced the corporate veil through severe financial commingling. The primary guarantor and the secondary co-signers are all liable. Execute the freezes immediately." Vance picked up the folder, briefly scanning the top page. "Do you want standard processing time for the notices, Ms. Thorne?" "No," I replied, standing up and walking toward the window. The rain continued to beat against the glass. "I want the notices sent via certified courier today. I want their bank accounts locked by the end of business hours. They will not have the opportunity to move a single dollar offshore or hide assets. When they wake up tomorrow, I want the full weight of this institution pressing down on them." Vance nodded. He did not ask questions. He recognized the tone of an executive who had made a final, unalterable decision. "I will have the couriers dispatched by noon," he said, turning toward the door. "The accounts will be frozen before 5. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind him. The machinery of corporate Illinois was now moving against my family. It is a cold, logical, and merciless entity. It does not pause for apologies, and it cannot be reasoned with through social media posts or neighborhood gossip. By tomorrow morning, the postman would arrive in their quiet, prestige-obsessed town. The certified letters would be handed over. The digital locks on their checking accounts would engage. The false empire Leo had built would collapse in an instant, dragging my arrogant parents down into the rubble with him. The social warfare they tried to wage against me was about to be eclipsed by the terrifying, paralyzing panic of total financial ruin. Friday morning dawned bright and clear over the Illinois prairie. The manicured lawns of my hometown gleamed with fresh dew, and the sprinkler systems hissed in perfect synchronized rhythm. It was a community built on pristine appearances, where social currency was determined by landscaping and the brand of vehicle parked in your driveway. In this secluded enclave, reality was often suspended, replaced by a curated illusion of perpetual success. At precisely 9 o'clock, 2 courier vans turned off the main highway, navigating the quiet residential streets. One vehicle parked in front of my parents' historic wraparound porch. The other idled outside the wrought iron gates of my brother's modern, oversized suburban estate. The drivers carried thick, heavy envelopes stamped with the stark, unyielding seal of Midwest Central Bank. I sat in my downtown Chicago office holding a mug of black tea, watching the delivery confirmations update on my digital monitor in real time. The fallout was instantaneous, rippling through their carefully constructed lives like a localized earthquake. Jessica was the first to encounter the invisible wall of institutional consequence. According to the transaction logs on my screen, she attempted to purchase $300 worth of organic groceries and imported wine at the elite local market at 9:15. I pictured her standing at the checkout register, wearing her designer athletic apparel, chatting idly with the cashier to maintain her affluent persona. She would have casually swiped her platinum debit card, waiting for the familiar beep of approval. Instead, the terminal flashed a stark, bright red error code. Insufficient funds, account frozen. She would have laughed, a breathy, nervous sound, brushing it off as a banking glitch. She probably handed the cashier a secondary credit card, the one linked to Leo's commercial logistics account. The second swipe would yield the exact same rejection. The line of affluent neighbors behind her would shift uncomfortably, their polite smiles turning into tight, judgmental stares. In a town where gossip moved faster than the wind, a declined credit card at the local market was a social death sentence. 100 miles away, I watched the frantic timestamps populate my system. Jessica abandoned the groceries and ran to her vehicle, dialing Leo. Leo was likely sitting in his exposed brick downtown loft, sipping imported espresso, pretending to review freight manifests. When he logged into his corporate banking portal to investigate his wife's panicked phone call, he did not find his usual dashboard. He found a locked screen. A dense legal block of text covered the monitor, citing specific violations of the commercial loan agreement. His operating capital, his payroll accounts, his personal checking, everything was frozen. The bank had executed a full asset lockdown. He could not transfer a single dollar. He could not pay his staff. He could not even buy a tank of gas. Meanwhile, the courier stood on my parents' front porch, requiring a physical signature. Richard, wearing his expensive morning robe, scrawled his name on the clipboard, expecting a mundane legal document or a neighborly summons. He opened the envelope on the kitchen island, adjusting his reading glasses. The foreclosure notice was not written in polite conversational English. It was drafted in the sharp, unforgiving syntax of corporate litigation. It detailed the exact dates of Leo's financial negligence, the breach of contract, and the activation of the collateral clause. It informed Richard and Brenda Thorne that their property deed was now under active seizure protocols to satisfy a delinquent commercial note. The sheer panic that gripped my family must have been blinding. The arrogant foundation they stood upon vanished in a matter of seconds. My personal cell phone, resting on the glass surface of my desk, began to vibrate. It did not stop for 3 hours. The incoming calls were a symphony of desperation, fear, and staggering hypocrisy. I did not answer a single one. I let every ring cycle into voicemail, allowing their mounting dread to echo into the digital void. By noon, Brenda had left 5 distinct, hysterical audio messages. I played them on speakerphone while I reviewed an unrelated quarterly earnings report, listening to her psychological descent. "Vivian, you need to call me back right now," her first message demanded, her voice shrill with indignation. "There is a ridiculous mistake with the bank. Our retirement accounts are locked. Call your manager or whoever is in charge and fix this immediately. Tell them who we are." Her second message arrived 20 minutes later, the tone shifting from commanding to frantic. "Vivian, pick up the phone. Leo is losing his mind. The bank is threatening to take our house." "Our house? How could your company do this? You have to stop them." By the 4th voicemail, the fear had curdled into venomous threats. "If you do not reverse this, I am calling a lawyer," Brenda screamed into the receiver. "I will sue you for emotional distress. You are doing this on purpose because you are jealous of your brother. You are trying to ruin us. Fix it or I swear you will regret it." She still believed she possessed leverage. She thought she could intimidate the regional director of a major financial institution with empty threats of a suburban lawsuit. She did not comprehend that the legal department of Midwest Central Bank employed an army of litigators who crushed frivolous claims before breakfast. Then came the text messages from my father. Richard had stood in his dining room less than a week ago, his face flushed with rage, pointing at the door and declaring I was no longer his daughter. He had discarded me with the casual ease of tossing out yesterday's newspaper, confident in his own unshakable security. Now staring down the barrel of homelessness and public humiliation, his pride evaporated. His text messages read like a masterclass in historical revisionism. "Vivian, honey, please call me. We are in a terrible bind. I know things got heated on Sunday, but family is family. You are my brilliant girl. You know the banking system better than anyone. There has to be a loophole or a form we can file to delay this. We need your expertise. Please help your old man." My brilliant girl. I stared at the words on the glowing screen. For 3.5 decades, I was the afterthought. I was the reliable, invisible workhorse, while Leo soaked up the sun on a pedestal built from their life savings. The moment their golden idol crumbled, the moment their own comfort was jeopardized, they scrambled to rewrite the narrative. Suddenly, my intelligence was valuable. Suddenly, my corporate career was not just a phase or a backup plan, but a vital, necessary lifeline. The hypocrisy was so profound, it bordered on the surreal. They were willing to swallow their pride and beg the daughter they had just disowned, all to maintain their country club image and keep the neighbors from discovering their financial rot. I sat back in my ergonomic chair sipping my tea. The hot liquid warmed my throat, a sharp contrast to the cold satisfaction settling deep in my chest. I did not reply to Richard. I did not delete Brenda's frantic voicemails. I archived them, preserving their panic in the secure servers of my phone. Silence is often mistaken for passivity, but in negotiations, silence is the heaviest weapon you can wield. By refusing to engage, I offered them no target for their anger, no surface to cling to, and no opportunity to manipulate the narrative. I trapped them in a vacuum of their own making. They were cut off from their funds, isolated in their sprawling homes, forced to confront the terrifying reality that their social standing was a hollow shell. They could not host dinner parties. They could not buy their way out of the crisis. They were entirely at the mercy of a corporate machine that did not recognize their last name or care about their country club handicap. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across my office, a new notification popped up on my desktop monitor. My chief risk officer, David, had sent an internal memo. The flag on the Vanguard Medical Logistics account updated. Leo, cornered and desperate, was making a move. Instead of accepting defeat, he was attempting to fight back. He had retained outside counsel to challenge the asset freezes. A new email from an unfamiliar low-tier legal firm had just arrived in our litigation department inbox, demanding an emergency meeting with the bank's regional oversight director to negotiate a settlement. I smiled, the expression thin and devoid of warmth. My brother was gearing up to wage a legal war against a faceless corporate entity, entirely unaware that the general commanding the opposing army was the very sister he had spent his entire life underestimating. The true trap was ready to spring. When cornered, a rational person assesses the exits. An arrogant person simply tries to break through the wall. Leo had spent his entire adulthood insulated from consequence, shielded by our parents' financial sacrifices and a community that applauded his superficial charm. He did not possess the psychological tools to process total defeat. In his mind, the frozen accounts and the foreclosure notices were not a definitive conclusion. They were merely an aggressive opening bid in a negotiation. He genuinely believed that every rule possessed a loophole, and every corporate entity harbored a weakness that could be exploited by a firm handshake and a confident smile. But confidence requires capital, and the digital locks on his checking accounts proved impenetrable. He could not hire a seasoned corporate litigator from the city. Top-tier legal representation required substantial retainer fees paid up front. Stripped of his liquidity, my brother was forced to resort to the bottom of the barrel. He hired a local practitioner from our hometown, a man whose primary legal experience consisted of residential divorces and minor property line disputes. This attorney operated out of a cramped office located next to a suburban dry cleaner, a stark contrast to the sprawling, glass-enclosed suites of the attorneys he was about to challenge. This local lawyer, operating under the delusion that suburban bluster could intimidate a financial empire, decided to employ a strategy of manufactured outrage. He drafted an email and sent it directly to the general litigation inbox of Midwest Central Bank. Late Friday afternoon, Vance walked into my office. The senior legal counsel rarely smiled. His resting expression was one of severe, calculated intelligence. But as he crossed the threshold and approached my desk, the corners of his mouth twitched with genuine amusement. He carried a single sheet of paper. "We receive dozens of desperate communications every week," Ms. Thorne Vance said, his deep voice carrying a note of dry humor. "But this one deserves special recognition for its sheer audacity." He placed the printed email on the glass surface of my desk. I leaned forward and scanned the text. The letterhead belonged to a firm I did not recognize. The contents were a masterclass in misplaced arrogance. The attorney demanded the immediate release of all frozen assets tied to Vanguard Medical Logistics. He claimed the bank had acted with undue hostility toward a hard-working family man, a pillar of the local community, who was simply experiencing a minor cash flow interruption. Then came the ultimatum. The lawyer stated that if the bank proceeded with the property foreclosures, he would contact regional media outlets. He threatened to organize a public relations campaign painting Midwest Central Bank as a predatory institution destroying innocent families. To avoid this supposed media circus, the attorney demanded an emergency in-person meeting first thing Monday morning. He insisted on bypassing the standard collections department. He specifically requested a sit-down with the regional oversight director to negotiate a fair and equitable settlement. I read the final paragraph twice. The irony was so potent it felt almost tangible in the cool, climate-controlled air of the room. "They are attempting to bully us with the threat of a suburban newspaper article," Vance remarked, adjusting his tailored cuffs. Usually I route these letters to the junior associates for a boilerplate rejection. A threat of this nature against a $7 billion portfolio is equivalent to attacking a battleship with a pebble. Shall I instruct the legal department to inform them that their request is denied, I looked up from the paper, meeting his steady gaze. A cold, quiet satisfaction settled over my shoulders. Leo and my parents were rallying their forces. They were gathering their fabricated outrage, preparing to drive to Chicago to strong-arm a faceless corporate executive. They thought they were going to sit across from a sympathetic bureaucrat, someone they could manipulate with tears and empty promises of future repayment. They were completely blind to the reality of their destination. "No," I replied, my voice smooth and resonant. "Do not reject the request. Grant the meeting." Vance raised an eyebrow, a rare display of surprise. "You want to entertain a negotiation with a delinquent borrower represented by a strip mall attorney?" "I have no intention of negotiating, Vance. I want them in the building. Schedule the meeting for 9 o'clock Monday morning in the primary executive boardroom. Instruct security to clear them through the lobby. Ensure the legal team prepares the final asset surrender documents. When they arrive, we will present them with two options: sign the surrender forms voluntarily to avoid fraud charges or face immediate crushing litigation." Vance nodded slowly, the professional mask sliding back into place. He recognized the tone of a directive that required no further questioning. "I will send the confirmation email immediately," he said. "Have a restful weekend, Miss Thorne." The door clicked shut, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the city below. The weekend stretched out before me, marked by a profound, unbroken silence. My personal phone did not ring. The frantic voicemails from my mother ceased. The passive-aggressive texts from my father vanished. They were too busy preparing their offensive. I imagined them sitting in their Prairie Town living room, strategizing. Jessica would be selecting the perfect outfit to convey affluent distress. Leo would be rehearsing his speech, practicing his earnest, victimized expressions in the mirror. Richard and Brenda would be reviewing their finances, convinced that their physical presence in a Chicago boardroom would force the bank to yield. They were marching confidently into a trap they built with their own hands. On Sunday evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a deep twilight shadow over my penthouse. I stood in my expansive walk-in closet, preparing for the collision. In the corporate arena, attire is not merely a matter of fashion. It is psychological warfare. It is armor. When I was a child, my mother always selected my clothing. She favored soft pastels, floral prints, and muted colors. She wanted me to blend in, to remain unobtrusive and quiet, while Leo commanded the center of attention in bright, bold, primary colors. She dressed me to be the supporting character in his grand narrative. I reached past the softer fabrics of my wardrobe and selected a custom-tailored midnight blue power suit. The fabric was a heavy, structured wool blend that draped flawlessly. The shoulders were sharp, commanding attention and projecting unyielding authority. It was a garment designed to dominate a room, leaving zero space for familial softness or nostalgic vulnerability. I paired it with a crisp, stark white silk blouse and a pair of stiletto heels that possessed the precise geometric lines of a weapon. I laid the outfit meticulously over the back of a velvet chair. I polished the silver face of my watch, a timepiece earned through grueling 80-hour work weeks and flawless portfolio management. Every detail was calculated. Every element was designed to communicate power, distance, and cold institutional reality. I poured myself a glass of mineral water and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window in my living room. The city stretched out a grid of endless, glowing arteries. Tomorrow, my family would leave their quiet, status-obsessed enclave. They would drive down the interstate, watching the towering skyscrapers rise in the distance, believing they were heading into a battle they could win. They would walk into the marble lobby of my building, hand over their identification to the security desk, and ride the elevator up to the executive floors. They thought they were preparing to beg and intimidate a stranger. They did not know they had an appointment with the daughter they threw away. The tension in my chest was not anxiety. It was the exhilarating electric anticipation of a long overdue reckoning. The pieces were perfectly aligned on the board. The only thing left to do was wait for the sun to rise and watch the doors of the boardroom open. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, biting chill that seemed to seep through the glass of my penthouse windows. The Chicago skyline cut a razor-sharp silhouette against the pale dawn sky. The towering buildings reflected the early light, like rows of drawn swords standing silent and unforgiving. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom, assessing my reflection. I adjusted the lapels of my custom-tailored midnight blue power suit. The structured wool blend felt heavy across my shoulders, functioning as a meticulously crafted suit of armor. The sharp lines of the jacket left no room for softness. I fastened a simple silver watch around my wrist, the cool metal grounding me in the present moment. 7:30. In exactly 90 minutes, the collision I had orchestrated would finally occur. I stepped out of my apartment and descended into the awakening city, my mind clear and my pulse remarkably steady. The atmosphere inside the executive suite of Midwest Central Bank was a masterclass in psychological intimidation. I walked into the primary boardroom on the 42nd floor, my stiletto heels sinking slightly into the dense charcoal carpeting before striking the hardwood border. The ambient temperature in the room was locked at a brisk 65 degrees. It was a deliberate environmental choice designed to keep occupants alert, slightly uncomfortable, and acutely aware of their surroundings. A long, heavy mahogany table dominated the center of the space. It was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the recessed lighting above. Surrounding the table were high-backed black leather chairs that seemed to swallow anyone who sat in them. The room possessed a silent gravity, a crushing stillness that only true institutional power can project. There were no decorative plants, no warm paintings, and no comforting touches. The walls were sheer floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying, uninterrupted view of the streets far below. From this vantage point, the city looked like a complex game board. It was a space engineered to make outsiders feel small, insignificant, and entirely at the mercy of the executives sitting across from them. At 8 o'clock, the heavy mahogany double doors clicked open. Vance, my senior legal counsel, walked in alongside David, my chief risk officer. Vance carried a thick black leather portfolio under his arm. He moved with the predatory grace of a seasoned litigator, his face a mask of professional indifference. He set the portfolio down at the far end of the mahogany table and unzipped it with a sharp metallic sound that echoed in the quiet room. He pulled out a neat, perfectly aligned stack of legal paperwork and placed it directly in the center of the table. This was the finalized foreclosure packet. It was the physical embodiment of my family's ruin. The crisp white pages were marked with red signature tabs detailing every fraudulent transfer Leo had executed, every breached corporate covenant, and the definitive, irrevocable seizure of my parents' residential deed. The stack of paper looked innocent, yet it contained enough legal force to obliterate 3 lives in a matter of seconds. I stood at the head of the table, resting my hands lightly on the polished wood. "We are treating this 9 o'clock appointment as a standard hostile default negotiation," I instructed. My voice was flat and resonant, carrying easily across the length of the room. "You will not offer them water or coffee. You will not engage in polite small talk or exchange pleasantries. When the debtors arrive, you will seat them and wait for my entrance." Vance nodded once his eyes fixed on the documents. "Under no circumstances will either of you disclose my identity or my title before I walk through those doors," I continued, ensuring my directives were crystal clear. "Let them assume they are waiting for a nameless, faceless regional director. Let them sit in the silence of this room and feel the weight of this building press down on them." Vance understood the assignment perfectly. He thrived in adversarial environments, viewing litigation as a complex puzzle to be solved without emotional interference. David, however, hesitated. David had recruited me to the bank 7 years ago. He had served as a mentor, guiding me through the ruthless labyrinth of commercial lending. He knew my work ethic intimately, but he also recognized the heavy psychological toll that familial betrayal could exact on a person. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looking from the towering stack of foreclosure documents to my face, his expression troubled. Vivian David said, his tone dropping the formal cadence of a boardroom briefing. "I have watched you dismantle rival firms and liquidate vast corporate portfolios without flinching. You are the most capable executive I have ever trained. But this is different. The names on those asset surrender forms belong to your parents and your brother." He pointed a finger at the stack of paper. "Once we present these documents, there is no stepping back. The legal exposure for them is catastrophic. They will lose their business, their home, and their standing. Are you emotionally prepared for the blowback of destroying your family's financial security?" The question hung in the chilled air of the boardroom. A minor flicker of internal conflict sparked in my chest, a brief involuntary response programmed by years of societal conditioning. Society insists that blood ties require endless forgiveness, that a daughter must always shield her parents from harm, regardless of their transgressions. For a fraction of a second, I pictured my mother standing in her prairie kitchen, holding a teacup, fiercely proud of her pristine suburban life. I pictured my father reading the Sunday paper on his wraparound porch, secure in his manufactured status. I held the power to erase their comfort with a single conversation. I turned away from the table and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling glass. I looked out over the sprawling grid of Chicago. The vehicles below looked like tiny, insignificant insects moving predictably along designated paths. The steel curves of Cloudgate caught the morning light shining brilliantly in the distance. I grounded myself in the unyielding reality of the situation. I was not destroying them. I did not force Leo to siphon capital from his logistics firm to finance luxury ski trips in Aspen. I did not force my parents to co-sign a high-risk commercial note pledging their only home to sustain a fraudulent aesthetic based on my brother's inflated ego. They made those decisions with their eyes wide open. They were fueled by unearned arrogance and toxic favoritism, worshiping a degree while dismissing my relentless labor. They dug the grave, they climbed inside, I was simply the executor holding the shovel tasked with filling it in. I turned back to face David and Vance. The brief flicker of doubt extinguished, leaving only cold, surgical clarity in its wake. "I am not destroying anything, David," I said, maintaining steady, unwavering eye contact with my mentor. "They destroyed themselves the moment they chose greed over diligence. They used stolen money to fund an illusion, and when that illusion collapsed, they expected me to empty my savings to shield them from the consequences. They disowned me because I refused to be their human shield. I am not ruining them. I am merely executing the paperwork they signed." David studied my face for a long moment. He saw no hesitation, no lingering guilt, and no fear. He offered a slow, understanding nod. He reached out and aligned the edges of the foreclosure packet, ensuring the stack sat perfectly square on the polished mahogany table. The trap was primed. The legal mechanisms were flawless. The only remaining variable was the arrival of the targets. I checked my watch again. 8:45. The opposing forces were already navigating the downtown traffic, likely complaining about the cost of parking and the congestion of the city's streets. They were marching blindly into a fortress designed to break their will, armed with nothing but suburban entitlement and a cheap local attorney who operated out of a strip mall. They thought they possessed the leverage to bully a financial institution into submission. I instructed Vance and David to take their positions in the boardroom while I retreated to my private office down the hall to monitor the security feeds. The final countdown had begun. The lobby of Midwest Central Bank was about to become the stage for a spectacular reckoning, and I intended to savor every single second of their impending realization. At 8:45, the high-definition security feed on my desktop monitor flickered, shifting from a rotating view of the exterior plaza to a fixed, wide-angle shot of the main lobby. I sat alone in my private office, a cup of green tea cooling beside my keyboard. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the smooth glass surface of the desk. The resolution was sharp enough to capture the intricate details of the slate floor and the brushed steel security turnstiles. I watched the revolving doors spin. 5 figures pushed through the glass partitions, stumbling slightly as they transitioned from the windy Chicago street into the cavernous, silent atrium of Midwest Central Bank. The invasion had begun. My brother Leo walked at the front of the pack. He wore a gray suit that looked expensive from a distance but lacked the precise tailoring required in the financial district. Next to him was a man I presumed to be his local attorney, wearing a boxy navy blazer and carrying a worn leather briefcase. Behind them trailed my parents and Jessica. They looked like a flock of disoriented birds blown terribly off course, craning their necks to stare at the soaring 80-foot ceilings and the imposing security personnel stationed at every entrance. I reached out and clicked the audio feed icon on my screen. The directional microphones embedded in the lobby ceiling captured their voices, piping the sound directly into my office speakers. $30 an hour for parking, Jessica complained, her voice echoing sharply against the stone walls. Her tone carried the distinct grating whine of someone who expected the world to hand her a validated ticket. "We should validate this upstairs. They are freezing our accounts and charging us to park. It is extortion." She tugged at the lapels of her beige trench coat, looking around the pristine space with a mixture of awe and defensive disdain. Beside her, my mother Brenda was busy adjusting the collar of her blouse. Brenda had chosen an outfit that screamed Prairie Town wealth, a matching tweed skirt and jacket ensemble accented by a heavy fake gold brooch. She patted her hair, attempting to project an aura of affluent belonging, entirely oblivious to the fact that her attire was a decade out of style for downtown corporate circles. My father Richard did not speak. He paced in a tight circle near a modern art sculpture, his hands buried deep in his trouser pockets. He looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the armed guards flanking the elevator banks. The bluster he displayed at the Sunday dinner table was conspicuously absent. The towering architecture of the building was performing its intended function, slowly eroding his unearned confidence before he even reached the reception desk. Leo led his cheap attorney toward the main security concourse. The concierge, a tall, impeccably dressed man named Thomas, stood behind a sweeping marble counter. Thomas managed access to the executive floors with the ruthless efficiency of a border guard. "We have a 9 o'clock appointment," Leo announced, slapping a palm flat against the marble. He projected his voice, attempting to sound like a titan of industry demanding immediate service. "Vanguard Medical Logistics. We are here to see the Regional Oversight Director." Thomas did not blink. He typed a few keystrokes into his terminal, his expression remaining perfectly neutral. "I see the appointment, sir. I will need government-issued identification from every member of your party to issue the visitor badges." Leo scoffed, shifting his weight. "I left my wallet in the console of my truck. Just print the badges. My lawyer is right here. He can vouch for me." I watched the monitor, a slow, cold smile forming on my lips. Leo was treating the premier financial institution in the state like a local tavern where the bouncer recognized his face. He genuinely expected the rules to bend simply because he found them inconvenient. "I require physical identification for every guest ascending to the executive levels." Thomas repeated his tone, dropping a fraction of a degree. "It is a strict building protocol. Without identification, you cannot pass the turnstiles." The local attorney, sensing the rising tension, stepped forward. He rummaged through his briefcase, pulling out a business card and sliding it across the counter. "Now listen here, son. We are dealing with an emergency corporate negotiation today. Time is sensitive. My client is under extreme duress, and we are not going to let red tape delay a meeting that your own legal department scheduled." Thomas looked at the business card. He did not pick it up. He looked back at Leo. "You have 14 minutes until your scheduled meeting. I suggest you retrieve your wallet from your vehicle, sir." The audio feed captured Leo releasing a heavy, frustrated sigh. He muttered an expletive under his breath, turned on his heel, and jogged back toward the revolving doors, leaving his family standing awkwardly in the center of the lobby. For the next 10 minutes, I observed my family waiting in the vast, unforgiving space. They migrated toward a low leather seating area, refusing to sit down. Jessica pulled out her phone, likely checking her social media feeds to see if her suburban followers were still offering sympathy. Brenda hovered near Richard, whispering anxiously. Richard finally spoke. His voice caught clearly on the microphone. "Just let the lawyer do the talking up there," he told his wife. "We go in, we explain a situation, and we show them we are reasonable people. These city bankers are just numbers on a screen. When they see a real family sitting across from them, they will negotiate. We just need to press the right buttons." He believed he was preparing for a sentimental transaction. He thought the tears Jessica was saving up and the righteous indignation he planned to project would function as valid currency to buy their way out of a commercial default. They viewed the bank as a faceless, monolithic entity that could be shamed into submission by a display of human vulnerability. They possessed no concept of the reality waiting for them on the 42nd floor. They were preparing a theatrical performance for an audience of one, and that specific audience member had spent the last 35 years memorizing their entire playbook. Leo returned breathless, his hair slightly disheveled from the wind outside. He tossed his driver's license onto the marble counter. Thomas scanned the card without a word, printed 5 temporary badges, and slid them across the surface. "You will need to scan these at the glass gates," Thomas instructed, gesturing toward the secure elevator bank. "Take car B directly to 42. A legal representative will collect you from the vestibule." Leo snatched the badges and distributed them to the group. They clipped the plastic squares to their lapels. As they walked toward the security turnstiles, they huddled closer together, drawing a collective shaky breath. The attorney adjusted his tie, looking up at the towering ceiling one last time, visibly intimidated by the scale of the battlefield he had chosen to enter. I watched them scan their passes. The glass gates glided open, granting them access to the inner sanctum. They stepped into the polished steel cabin of the elevator. My mother offered a weak, trembling smile to Jessica. Leo stood at the front, his shoulders squared, attempting to project a hollow bravery that was crumbling by the second. The stainless steel doors slid shut, severing the camera feed and sealing them inside the ascending vault. I sat back in my chair, turning off the monitor. The silence in my office felt profound, heavy with the weight of impending justice. The dramatic irony was exquisite. They were rising through the building, climbing hundreds of feet into the sky, convincing themselves they were about to outsmart the system. They were marching toward their own execution, fully confident they could negotiate with the executioner. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my tailored trousers. I picked up my silver pen, slid it into the interior pocket of my suit jacket, and walked toward the door of my office. The waiting game was about to begin in the boardroom, and I intended to let the psychological pressure reach a boiling point before I finally turned the handle and showed them the true face of the institution they tried to conquer. I walked down the private executive corridor toward the primary boardroom. The hallway featured specialized acoustic paneling designed to absorb ambient noise, creating a deadened, sterile environment. My heels sank silently into the thick charcoal carpet. I stopped just outside the heavy mahogany doors. Alongside the entrance ran a stretch of frosted architectural glass. The translucent barrier blurred the finer details, but the seams between the panels provided a clear, unobstructed line of sight directly into the room. I stood in the shadows of the hallway and watched my family take their seats. I had explicitly instructed the security detail to escort them into the room and leave them entirely alone. There was no administrative assistant to offer them sparkling water. There was no junior associate to provide polite small talk. They were left to marinate in the severe climate-controlled chill of the 42nd floor. I checked my silver watch. I planned to let them wait for a deliberate, agonizing 15 minutes. In corporate negotiations, time is a psychological weapon. When individuals accustomed to privilege are forced to wait in a stark, unfamiliar environment, their fabricated bravado begins to erode. In their prairie town, they were local royalty. They filled any silence with their own voices, dictating the pace of every interaction. In this glass box, suspended high above Chicago, the silence belonged to the institution, and it was actively consuming them. Through the narrow gap in the frosted glass, I observed the rapid deterioration of their confidence. Leo sat near the center of the long table. He was a man who relied entirely on forward momentum and superficial charm. Stalled in this quiet room, his physical tells betrayed his rising panic. He tugged sharply at his silk tie, loosening the knot, as if the collar of his shirt was suddenly restricting his airway. His right leg bounced in a rapid, nervous rhythm beneath the table, vibrating the heavy wood. He kept glancing toward the closed doors, expecting a sympathetic banker to walk through and rescue him from his own incompetence. Beside him, the local attorney unpacked his worn leather briefcase. The lawyer arranged a few thin manila folders and a yellow legal pad on the polished mahogany surface. The meager stack of papers looked pathetic against the vast, intimidating expanse of the table. He clicked a cheap plastic pen repeatedly, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet room. He kept looking around at the sheer glass walls and the digital presentation screens, the dawning realization settling over his features that he was profoundly out of his depth. At the far end of the table, the united front of my parents began to fracture. Richard leaned close to Brenda, his face rigid with tension. The directional microphones embedded in the ceiling captured his harsh, strained whisper. "I told you we should have brought a real lawyer from the city," Richard hissed, gesturing vaguely toward Leo's legal counsel. "This place is not a local credit union, Brenda. Look at this room. They are going to eat us alive." Brenda clutched her imitation gold brooch, her knuckles turning white. "Stop panicking," she whispered back, though her voice trembled. "We are reasonable people. We will explain about the grandchildren. We will tell them this is a temporary setback. They have to listen to reason." They were still clinging to the delusion that corporate finance operated on a foundation of empathy. They thought they could barter with their status as grandparents. Then Jessica committed a tactical error born of pure, unadulterated narcissism. Unable to endure the crushing silence and desperate to reclaim some semblance of control, she reached into her quilted designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone. If she could not manipulate the executives in the room, she would manufacture sympathy from her audience back home. She held the device out at arm's length, tilting her chin down and widening her eyes to capture the perfect expression of affluent distress. She was framing a selfie with the imposing Chicago skyline in the background, likely drafting a caption about fighting corporate greed to save her family. Before her thumb could press the shutter button, the mahogany doors swung open. Vance stepped into the boardroom, moving with the silent, predatory grace of a seasoned litigator. David followed close behind, his expression an impenetrable mask of institutional detachment. Jessica froze her phone, still suspended in the air. Vance did not introduce himself. He did not offer his hand for a greeting. He walked directly to the center of the table and placed a secure metallic lockbox on the polished wood. "Good morning," Vance said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that commanded instant obedience. "You are currently seated in a restricted corporate sector of Midwest Central Bank. Due to strict confidentiality protocols and federal privacy regulations, unauthorized recording devices, cellular phones, and wireless transmitters are strictly prohibited in this boardroom." He tapped the top of the lockbox with a single finger. "I must ask each of you to power down your mobile devices and surrender them immediately. They will remain secured in this Faraday receptacle until our negotiation concludes." Leo bristled, his false courage flaring up. "Now wait a minute. We are not surrendering our personal property. I need my phone to access my banking app to show you our deposit history." Vance turned his gaze toward my brother. The look was chilling, entirely devoid of warmth or compromise. Mr. Thorne, Vance replied smoothly, "We already possess your entire deposit history, along with every withdrawal, wire transfer, and vendor payment you have executed over the past 36 months. Surrender the devices, or security will escort you back to the lobby, and the foreclosure proceedings will finalize uncontested by noon." The threat was delivered with such casual precision that the fight drained out of Leo instantly. The small-town bullying tactics evaporated. The local attorney cleared his throat nervously and immediately placed his cell phone into the box. Richard and Brenda followed suit, their hands shaking as they relinquished their only connection to the outside world. Jessica, her face flushed dark red with humiliation, dropped her phone into the container. Vance snapped the lid shut, locking it with a sharp click. The power dynamic shifted permanently. They were stripped of their distractions, their social media audiences, and their ability to summon external help. They were isolated, trapped in the belly of the beast, entirely at the mercy of the institution. David stepped forward. He carried the black leather portfolio Vance had prepared earlier that morning. David unzipped the heavy casing and extracted the finalized foreclosure packet. He placed the thick, dense stack of legal documents onto the center of the mahogany table. The paper hit the wood with a heavy, definitive thud that seemed to rattle the very foundation of the room. The packet was thick enough to resemble a phone book. It was bristling with red plastic signature tabs highlighting every fraudulent transaction, every breached corporate covenant, and the irrevocable seizure of the residential collateral. The sheer volume of the evidence was staggering. It visually communicated the depth of the bank's investigation and the inescapable reality of their ruin. The local attorney stared at the stack of paper, his eyes widening. He looked down at his own thin, pathetic legal pad, the color draining entirely from his face. He realized he was not here to negotiate a settlement. He was here to witness an execution. Richard stared at the red tabs, his breath hitching audibly in the quiet room. Brenda pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically between the imposing lawyers standing before them and the towering pile of their financial sins. No one spoke. The silence in the boardroom transitioned from tense to deafening. The air grew thick-heavy with the terrifying realization that they were outmatched, outgunned, and out of time. They were sitting in a fortress built by the very forces they had spent their lives mocking and underestimating. I stood in the hallway, my hand resting lightly on the cool brass handle of the boardroom door. The stage was set perfectly. The psychological pressure inside that room had reached a critical breaking threshold. Their arrogance was shattered. Their defenses were dismantled. They were sitting in the wreckage of their own entitlement, desperate for the regional oversight director to walk in and offer them a sliver of mercy. I smoothed the lapels of my midnight blue suit one final time, took a slow, measured breath, and turned the handle. I gripped the solid brass handle of the primary boardroom door. The metal felt cool and heavy against my palm. I turned the mechanism. The latch disengaged with a deep, resonant thud. I pushed the heavy mahogany barrier inward. The hinges moved in perfect silence, a testament to the meticulous engineering of the executive floor. As I crossed the threshold, the crisp, climate-controlled air of the corridor rushed into the stagnant, suffocating atmosphere of the meeting space. I did not look at the individuals seated around the polished wood with the familiar, conditioned eyes of a younger sibling. I did not view them as the authority figures who had governed my childhood. I observed them through the detached, calculating lens of a senior banking executive evaluating toxic, irredeemable liabilities. My brother was seated nearest the entrance, his head snapped toward the noise. The hollow, fabricated bravado he had been desperately attempting to project vanished in a fraction of a second. The healthy, artificially baked color drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving behind a pale, sickly pallor. His jaw dropped. His eyes widened to an unnatural degree. He looked like a man who had just watched a phantom step out of the concrete wall. Across the expansive table, my mother reacted with a sharp, audible intake of breath. She gasped, a jagged scraping sound that echoed harshly against the pristine acoustic panels of the chamber. Her hand flew to her chest. Her fingers clutched the cheap imitation gold brooch pinned to her tweed lapel, gripping the jewelry as if the metal could somehow anchor her to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. Jessica merely stared, her mouth parted in mute, paralyzed confusion. Her meticulously curated suburban aesthetic failed to mask the raw, primal confusion washing over her features. The local attorney, entirely oblivious to the complex familial dynamics at play, looked mildly annoyed by the interruption. He adjusted his cheap necktie, assuming a rogue administrative assistant had stumbled into a restricted corporate negotiation. My father was the only member of the party who managed to find his voice. He grabbed the thick edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white as he forced himself to stand. His knees lacked their usual robust strength. He hovered in a half-crouched posture, his gaze darting frantically over my midnight blue power suit, my pristine silk blouse, and the unyielding glacial expression locked onto my face. "Vivian," he stammered. His voice sounded weak, thin, and entirely stripped of the booming tyrannical authority he wielded at his Prairie Town dining table. "What are you doing here? Did you come to help us?" I did not answer him immediately. I stepped fully into the room and let the heavy door swing shut behind me. The latch engaged with a definitive echoing click, sealing the chamber and trapping them inside. I walked the length of the boardroom. My stiletto heels struck the hardwood border with deliberate, rhythmic precision. Each individual step functioned as a metronome, ticking down the final seconds of their fabricated empire. The sound cut through the breathless silence, sharp and uncompromising. I bypassed my brother without a single glance. I ignored my mother. I approached the head of the table, the undisputed seat of ultimate authority. David, my chief risk officer, and Vance, my senior legal counsel, stepped back simultaneously in a fluid display of profound professional respect, clearing the path for their commanding officer. The local attorney finally registered the deep deference displayed by the two imposing corporate lawyers. The color began to drain from his face as well, his complexion rapidly mirroring my brother's mounting terror. The lawyer looked from Vance to me, the terrifying arithmetic clicking into place in his mind. I pulled out the high-backed leather executive chair and sat down. The dense cushioning enveloped me firm and supportive. I placed my hands delicately over the thick red-tabbed foreclosure packet resting in the center of the table. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored jacket and retrieved my silver fountain pen. I pressed the top mechanism. Click. The precise, cold, metallic sound sliced through the suffocating silence. It was the only noise in the room, sharp as a scalpel. I lifted my gaze. I looked directly into the terrified, searching eyes of the man who had raised me, the man who had ordered me to empty my life savings to fund a lie and then banish me into the night when I refused to comply. "I am not here to help you, Richard," I said. My voice was perfectly calibrated, projecting effortlessly to every corner of the glass-enclosed room. It contained zero anger, zero sorrow, and zero forgiveness. It was the voice of inevitable consequence. "You disowned your daughter a week ago." I let the sentence hang in the chilled air, allowing the brutal truth of his own impulsive actions to settle heavily over his shoulders. "I am here as the regional director of Midwest Central Bank." I continued tracing the crisp edge of the legal dossier with the tip of my silver pen. "And I am here to collect my bank's money." The reaction was instantaneous and cataclysmic. It was as though I had detonated a concussive shockwave inside the sealed room. The atmospheric pressure seemed to plummet, sucking the oxygen directly from their lungs. Richard collapsed backward into his seat. All the structural strength abandoned his limbs. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He struggled in vain to reconcile the obedient, discarded child he remembered with the relentless corporate titan commanding the execution of his entire estate. The cognitive dissonance paralyzed him. Brenda let out a soft, high-pitched whimper. She buried her face in her trembling hands. The grand illusion she had fiercely protected her entire adult life shattered into microscopic, irreparable fragments. She finally understood that the elite, untouchable prestige she craved had always belonged to me, not her golden son. She had worshipped a mirage and thrown away the only authentic power her family possessed. Leo looked physically ill. The grim reality of his situation crashed over him with tidal force. He was not negotiating with a sympathetic local lender who cared about his golf handicap. He was not facing a faceless bureaucracy he could charm with a firm handshake. He was sitting across the table from the exact person he had spent 3 decades underestimating, mocking, and exploiting. He realized with agonizing, inescapable clarity that his fate rested entirely in the hands of the sister he had so casually betrayed. The trap had fully sprung shut. The steel jaws were locked tight. The local attorney broke the silence, his voice pitching high with frantic, uncalculated panic. He turned to Leo, his hands waving erratically over his useless legal pad. "You did not tell me the regional director was your sister," the lawyer hissed, abandoning every ounce of professional decorum. "You said we were meeting a neutral third party. This is a severe conflict of interest. We can contest this entire proceeding. This is highly unethical." I shifted my attention to the lawyer. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer, concentrated weight of my authority pinned the man to his chair. "You are welcome to file a formal contestation," I informed him, my tone laced with glacial politeness. "However, I suggest you review the documentation sitting before you first." The conflict of interest protocols were strictly and flawlessly observed. I formally waived my recusal rights, a strategic maneuver fully permitted under federal lending guidelines when internal fraud is suspected. Every signature, every asset freeze, and every foreclosure notice was executed strictly by the book. The process was verified by the gentleman standing to my left, who happens to be the senior litigation counsel for a $7 billion financial institution. Vance offered a short, predatory nod to the trembling local practitioner. "Furthermore," I added, locking my eyes onto the attorney and narrowing them slightly, "if you attempt to stall this legal proceeding with frivolous filings, my legal department will petition the state bar to sanction you for enabling documented financial fraud. I strongly suggest you advise your clients to proceed with extreme caution." The lawyer swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously above his cheap collar. He slowly lowered his hands, retreating deep into the back of his leather chair, effectively abandoning his clients to the impending slaughter. Jessica, realizing the lawyer was entirely useless and their defenses were obliterated, leaned forward over the mahogany wood. Her eyes were wild with desperate, uncalculated rage. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger across the table, initiating the next phase of the confrontation, completely oblivious to the fact that she was about to ignite a fresh, devastating explosion. "You orchestrated this entire nightmare," Leo shouted, his voice cracking as the primal fear gripping his throat mutated into frantic hostility. He shoved his heavy leather chair backward. The legs dragged against the hardwood floor with a harsh, grating screech. "You set a trap for us. You knew Vanguard Medical Logistics was struggling, and you used your position to buy up the debt just to humiliate me. This is illegal, Vivian. It is a targeted vendetta." He was clinging to the only narrative that allowed him to remain the victim. In his mind, his elite East Coast education and his visionary status shielded him from ordinary failure. If his empire was crumbling, it had to be the result of a sinister, calculated sabotage orchestrated by a jealous sibling. He could not fathom that he was merely a statistical default, caught in a routine corporate sweep. I did not raise my voice to meet his escalating volume. I simply opened the red-tabbed folder resting in front of me. I extracted a single sheet of paper, crisp and heavy with the bank's official watermark. I placed my index finger on the top edge of the document and slid it smoothly across the expansive mahogany table. The paper glided over the polished wood, stopping mere inches from his trembling hands. "Read the timestamp in the upper right corner," I instructed, my tone possessing the quiet, lethal calm of a falling blade. Leo stared down at the page. His eyes scanned the dense legal text darting back and forth before locking onto the numerical date printed in bold black ink. "That is the official acquisition manifest," I continued, ensuring every person in the room absorbed the undeniable reality of the timeline. "Midwest Central Bank formally absorbed the distressed portfolio containing your commercial note at 4:32 on Friday afternoon." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the desk. "You sat at the dining room table on Sunday evening. You looked me in the eye and demanded $400,000, knowing full well your accounts were already hemorrhaging. I did not hunt you down, Leo. I did not construct a trap. You walked blindly into the jaws of a corporate machine that had already swallowed your debt, 2 days before you even confessed your failure. You are not a victim of my vengeance. You are a victim of your own staggering incompetence." The definitive proof of the timeline shattered his fabricated defense. He stared at the date, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The realization that he was entirely responsible for his own destruction drained the last remaining reserves of his false bravado. He slumped back into his chair, looking small, defeated, and entirely devoid of the golden boy aura our parents had manufactured for him. Jessica realized the bluster and suburban threats were entirely useless in this environment. The social media armor she wore so proudly melted away. She broke down. These were not the rehearsed, delicate tears she deployed in my lobby or during her suburban broadcasts. This was visceral, ugly, uncalculated panic. Her chest heaved, pulling in jagged, desperate breaths. Mascara ran down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks, ruining her flawless aesthetic. "Vivian, please," Jessica sobbed, leaning heavily over the table, her hands clasped together in a posture of genuine supplication. "I am begging you, do not take the house. We have nowhere else to go. The children love their schools. You cannot put your own nieces and nephews out on the street. I will do whatever you want. We will set up a payment plan. Just give us a chance to fix this." She was offering empty promises drawn from an empty bank account. She wanted a reprieve, a miraculous pardon granted out of familial pity. Before I could address her, my mother intervened. Brenda could no longer endure the terrifying collapse of her favored child. She rose from her seat, her tweed jacket wrinkling as she reached frantically across the vast expanse of the boardroom table. She stretched her arm out, attempting to grasp my hand. "Vivian, honey, listen to me," Brenda pleaded. Her voice was thick with desperation, the fake gold brooch trembling against her chest. "Blood is blood. We are your family. We are the ones who raised you. We can move past Sunday. We can forgive the harsh words. Just look into your heart and remember that we are your blood." I watched her hand stretching toward me, fingers trembling, reaching for a connection she had severed the moment it became inconvenient. I pulled my hand back, folding my fingers neatly together and resting them on the edge of the leather folder. The physical rejection was swift and definitive. Her hand hovered in the empty space over the mahogany wood for a painful, agonizing second before she slowly withdrew it, her face crumbling into an expression of profound, unbearable sorrow. Blood did not underwrite this loan, I said, my voice carrying the glacial chill of the city outside, and blood will not satisfy the default. I opened the dossier to the second tab. The time for negotiations had long passed. It was time to deliver the final crushing inventory of their sins. I looked directly at Leo, holding his gaze as I began to read aloud from the itemized audit report. You claimed Vanguard Medical Logistics suffered a temporary cash flow interruption due to sluggish shipping markets. I stated my words, clipping the silent air with surgical precision. The forensic accounting tells a different story. In February, you diverted $45,000 of commercial operating capital to charter a private flight and book a 7-night stay at a luxury resort in Aspen. Jessica let out a sharp, muted sob, covering her mouth with her hands. In April, I continued turning the page, the crisp rustle of the paper serving as a sharp punctuation mark. You authorized a $30,000 wire transfer, categorizing the expense as executive training seminars. The receiving institution was the elite private academy your children attend. You used business capital to pay personal tuition. I flipped to the third tab, my eyes locking onto Jessica. Last month, you withdrew $50,000 under the guise of warehouse facility upgrades. That money was paid directly to a high-end residential contractor to install the imported marble kitchen island where you sat recording your tearful, victimized social media videos. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the jagged sound of Jessica crying. They were pinned beneath the blinding spotlight of the truth. Every fraudulent transfer, every stolen dollar, and every desperate lie was laid bare on the polished wood. You did not build a logistics empire, I told my brother, ensuring the finality of the statement resonated in his bones. You operated a sophisticated theft ring, stealing from your own creditors to finance an opulent illusion. You pierced the corporate veil. You are personally liable for every single cent. I closed the audit section and pulled out the final, most devastating piece of documentation. It was the original residential collateral agreement. I slid the thick stapled contract across the table, aiming it precisely between Richard and Brenda. I looked at my parents. They had spent decades treating my relentless corporate climb like a trivial hobby while they worshipped his expensive medical management degree. They had treated his every word like gospel and my every achievement like an afterthought. You trusted his pedigree, I said softly, the quiet intensity of my voice demanding their total, unbroken attention. You believed his elite education made him a visionary. You were so desperate to maintain the pristine image of your perfect son that you co-signed a high-risk commercial extension. You pledged the deed to the home you have owned for 40 years. I tapped the signature line on the document with the tip of my silver pen. You bet your house on his lies, I said, delivering the fatal blow, and the bank is calling the bet. Richard stared at his own signature, the ink mocking him from the page. The terrifying reality of his impending homelessness shattered the last remaining fragments of his sanity. He gripped the edge of the table, his face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He reverted to the only tactic he understood. He attempted to deploy raw, unearned intimidation. You will not get away with this, Richard snarled, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger at my face. I will ruin you, Vivian. I will march straight to the board of directors. I will hire a real firm from the city, and we will sue you for targeted harassment, malicious intent, and extortion. I will see you stripped of your title and thrown into the street. The hollow threat echoed uselessly against the thick glass walls. Vance stepped forward from the shadows. The senior legal counsel moved with imposing, quiet authority. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the deep, resonant certainty of a man who held the undisputed high ground. I highly advise against making verbal threats in a restricted corporate sector. Mr. Thorne Vance stated, his gaze fixed on my father with predatory calm. Everything executed in this room has been done strictly by the book. The forensic audit is flawless. The signatures are authenticated. If you attempt to file a frivolous lawsuit against Midwest Central Bank, our litigation department will not simply seek dismissal. We will pursue aggressive counterclaims for legal fees, and we will forward the evidence of your son's financial fraud directly to the federal prosecutor's office. Vance adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his expression turning cold and final. Any further harassment threats or raised voices will result in your immediate removal by armed security, Vance concluded. The fight drained out of Richard instantly. His shoulders slumped, his chest caving inward as the sheer, insurmountable weight of their powerlessness crashed down upon him. He looked at his son, the golden idol who had just cost him his entire life savings. He looked at his wife, weeping silently into her hands. And finally he looked at me, the discarded daughter who now possessed the absolute, unyielding authority to determine their future. They were crushed, trapped in the inescapable wreckage of their own greed, waiting for the final definitive boundary to be drawn. The immediate fallout in the boardroom possessed a devastating, suffocating stillness. Vance had delivered the final legal warning with the clinical precision of a surgeon, severing a diseased limb, and the result was instantaneous. The fight completely evaporated from the room. My family, stripped of their leverage, their financial security, and their delusions of grandeur, collapsed inward. They realized they possessed no sympathetic daughter to bail them out, no suburban community to shield them, and zero avenues for escape. My brother sat frozen in his high-backed leather chair. The golden boy aura that had shielded him from consequence for 38 years was gone, replaced by the hollow, terrified stare of a man facing federal fraud charges. Vance stepped forward, sliding a crisp, unblemished document across the mahogany wood. It was the voluntary asset surrender agreement. The terms are straightforward. Vance stated his voice, a low, resonant hum. You sign over the remaining liquid capital, the commercial real estate leases, and the physical inventory of Vanguard Medical Logistics to Midwest Central Bank. In exchange, the institution will decline to forward the evidence of your financial commingling to the state prosecutor's office. You lose the business, but you retain your freedom. Leo stared at the printed contract. For his entire life, whenever he encountered an obstacle, someone else had stepped in to clear the path. My parents had paid for his mistakes, smoothed over his failures, and financed his illusions. Now, sitting in a Chicago high-rise, the safety net was gone. He was forced to confront the unyielding reality of his own actions. He reached out. His fingers trembled so severely he could barely grip the cheap plastic pen his local attorney had abandoned on the table. He pressed the ballpoint tip to the signature line. The ink scratched against the paper, a harsh, jagged sound that echoed through the quiet chamber. He signed his name, transferring his entire fabricated empire back to the creditors he had defrauded. Jessica watched him sign, her face a mask of ruined makeup and profound disbelief. The affluent lifestyle she had meticulously curated on social media was officially dead. There would be no more luxury vehicles, no more imported marble countertops, and no more elite private academies. The reality of their new existence was settling over her, heavy and inescapable. She would have to return to their prairie town and face the neighbors she had spent years trying to impress. The gossip would be ruthless. Next, Vance turned his attention to my parents. He presented the finalized foreclosure notice for the residential collateral. Richard looked down at the deed to the home he had owned for 4 decades, the house with the wraparound porch, the manicured lawn, and the formal dining room where he had ordered me to empty my savings. It was the epicenter of their social standing. Losing that property meant moving into a modest apartment, downsizing their entire existence, and admitting profound defeat to the very community they sought to dominate. My father aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. The robust, tyrannical patriarch who had banged his fist against the dinner table was replaced by a fragile, broken old man. He did not yell. He did not threaten lawsuits or point fingers. The unassailable logic of the corporate machinery had crushed his spirit. He signed the acknowledgement of seizure without uttering a single syllable. Brenda watched her husband sign away their shelter. Her hands shook as she adjusted the collar of her tweed jacket, clinging to the last remnants of her affluent costume. The social facade she had protected with such fierce, toxic favoritism was permanently destroyed. They had sacrificed their diligent, capable daughter to elevate a son who ultimately orchestrated their ruin. The documents were signed. The legal transfer was complete. Vance gathered the paperwork, tapping the edges against the table to align the pages perfectly. He slipped the bundle into his black leather portfolio and zipped it shut, sealing their fate. "The meeting is concluded," I announced, keeping my voice smooth, steady, and devoid of any lingering emotion. They stood up. Their movements were slow, stiff, and uncoordinated, like survivors emerging from the wreckage of a severe collision. Leo did not look at me. He stared at the floor, his shoulders hunched, carrying the crushing weight of his failure. Jessica grabbed her designer handbag, holding it tightly against her chest, as if the leather could somehow protect her from the cold reality waiting outside the building. The local attorney packed his briefcase and practically sprinted toward the door, desperate to escape the disastrous scene. My parents lingered near the edge of the mahogany table. Richard offered a vacant, hollow stare, his eyes focused on a space just past my shoulder. But Brenda could not leave in silence. She required one final attempt to assert control, one last desperate maneuver to inflict emotional pain on the daughter who had refused to break. She turned to face me. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wide, burning with a mixture of grief and deeply entrenched bitterness. She leaned forward, gripping the back of a leather chair for support. "How can you live with yourself?" Brenda asked, her voice trembling, laced with the sharpest venom she could muster. "Doing this to your own family, destroying us. How do you sleep at night knowing what you have done?" It was the ultimate guilt trip, the classic weapon she had deployed throughout my entire childhood to ensure compliance. She expected me to flinch. She wanted me to lower my gaze, to exhibit some small fraction of remorse, to validate her belief that my professional boundaries were an act of profound cruelty. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I remained seated in the executive chair, my posture immaculate, my expression resting in total, unbothered serenity. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and delivered my final response. "I am living very comfortably in the life I built for myself," I said softly, allowing the quiet certainty of my words to resonate in the chilled air. "Drive safe." The response struck her like a physical blow. The absolute lack of guilt, the impenetrable armor of my self-assurance, stripped away her final illusion of control. She had no ammunition left. The emotional blackmail that had governed our dynamic for 35 years was rendered entirely useless. Vance pressed a button on the wall console. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. 2 uniformed security guards stepped into the threshold, their presence large and unyielding. "Please escort our guests to the lobby," Vance instructed the guards. My family turned away. They walked out of the boardroom in a slow, defeated procession. I watched them step into the quiet, acoustically dampened corridor. The heavy wooden doors pulled shut behind them, the brass latch clicking into place, severing the connection for the final time. I sat alone in the vast, glass-enclosed space. I looked out the window at the soaring Chicago skyline, the steel and concrete structures standing firm against the morning light. The internal conflict that had flickered briefly earlier that day was completely resolved. I searched my conscience for any trace of regret, any lingering shadow of the dutiful daughter who felt obligated to sacrifice her peace for their comfort. I found nothing. Instead, a profound, exquisite sense of liberation washed over me. The heavy, suffocating burden I had carried for over 3 decades lifted from my shoulders, dissipating into the cool, conditioned air. I felt lighter. I felt invincible. I did not destroy my family. I merely stopped functioning as their human shield. They had constructed a fragile house of cards based on deceit, entitlement, and toxic favoritism. When the wind blew, the structure collapsed under its own weight. I simply refused to stand in the rubble and rebuild it for them. The boundary was permanently set. The toxic cycle was broken. I picked up my silver fountain pen and slid it back into the interior pocket of my midnight blue jacket and stood up from the table. I walked out of the boardroom and headed back to my private office, ready to continue managing my empire, leaving the architects of their own ruin far behind me. 1 year later, the unforgiving heat of that fateful summer had long since faded into a distant memory, replaced by the crisp, biting chill of an early Chicago autumn. I walked through Millennium Park on a Tuesday morning, the collar of my wool cashmere coat turned up against the sharp wind whipping off Lake Michigan. The leaves on the ancient oak trees had turned brilliant shades of amber and burnt orange, drifting down to scatter across the concrete pathways. The city moved around me in a familiar, rhythmic symphony of transit buses, distant sirens, and the hurried footsteps of thousands of professionals chasing their own ambitions. I held a steaming cup of dark roast coffee, letting the heat seep through the cardboard sleeve into my palms. I did not have to rush. I dictated my own schedule now. My trajectory at Midwest Central Bank had soared beyond even my own rigorous expectations. In the 12 months following the liquidation of Vanguard Medical Logistics, the board of directors recognized the surgical precision with which I handled the distressed asset acquisition. They elevated me to executive vice president. I now controlled a vast national division, overseeing commercial lending operations across 14 states. The heavy lingering anxiety of my youth, the constant suffocating need to prove my worth to a family that refused to see me, had vanished entirely. I stopped walking when I reached the center of the plaza. Towering before me sat the iconic gleaming structure of Cloudgate. The monumental sculpture rested on the pavement like a drop of liquid mercury frozen in time. The polished, seamless steel surface caught the early morning sunlight, reflecting the jagged, towering Chicago skyline in its curved expanse. I stared into the metal, watching the distorted but unbroken image of the skyscrapers, the clouds, and my own silhouette standing firm in the foreground. The sculpture served as a perfect silent metaphor for the life I had constructed. It was forged under immense pressure, polished through relentless friction, and rendered unyielding to the elements. It did not absorb the chaos around it. It simply reflected the undeniable reality of the world back onto itself. Through the quiet, inevitable channels of the suburban grapevine, news of my former family occasionally reached my ears. I never sought out the information. I had severed all direct contact, blocking their numbers and ignoring the sparse, desperate emails that slipped through the spam filters during the first few months. But my hometown was an insular, gossip-fueled ecosystem, and a fall from grace of that magnitude could not be kept secret. A former high school acquaintance who worked in regional accounting updated me during a chance encounter at a downtown networking event. The illusion Leo fought so fiercely to protect had crumbled into dust. Stripped of his fraudulent operating capital and blacklisted by every commercial lender in the state, his logistics firm was dismantled and sold for scraps. He was forced to enter the conventional workforce, relying on a resume that featured a decade of inflated titles and zero practical execution. The golden boy, the supposed titan of industry, now worked as a mid-level shift supervisor at a regional freight distribution center. He clocked in at dawn, trading his bespoke linen suits for a standard-issue polo shirt and a high-visibility safety vest. He spent his days answering to a district manager a decade younger than him, tracking barcode scans for a rigid hourly wage. Jessica experienced an equally severe reckoning. The luxury vehicles were repossessed. The country club membership was revoked due to unpaid dues. She was forced to abandon her pristine suburban estate and move her family into a cramped, generic rental duplex on the unfashionable side of town. Her curated social media presence went permanently dark. She could no longer broadcast unboxing videos or host catered luncheons. The local neighbors, the same people who once offered her endless sympathy online, quickly distanced themselves the moment the stench of bankruptcy attached itself to her name. She learned the harsh, unforgiving lesson that status in their world meant nothing without the financial substance to back it up. My parents endured the most profound transition of all. The bank foreclosed on the sprawling house with the wraparound porch and the manicured lawn. The residential property was auctioned off to a young corporate couple from the city. Richard and Brenda were forced to downsize into a modest two-bedroom apartment located behind a busy commercial strip mall. The poetic justice of their relocation was striking. I learned that the heavy mahogany dining table, the exact piece of furniture where my father had slammed his fist and ordered me out of his life, would not fit through the narrow doorframe of their new apartment unit. They had to sell it to a liquidator for a fraction of its original value. The physical stage where they had enacted their toxic favoritism and issued their ultimate ultimatum was gone auctioned off to strangers. They lived in quiet, forced obscurity. The boastful pride they once projected vanished. They could no longer brag about their visionary son, and they possessed no avenue to claim the success of their discarded daughter. They had wagered their entire comfortable existence on a lie, and the house had collected the debt. They never reached out again. After the final documents were signed in the boardroom, they understood that the bridge was burned to ash and the ashes were scattered. I never looked back. I did not experience a single sleepless night, wondering how they were coping with their new reality. Guilt is an emotion reserved for those who inflict unprovoked harm. I inflicted nothing. I simply held up a mirror, forcing them to look at the consequences of their own choices. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the rich, bitter flavor ground me in the crisp autumn morning. I turned away from the gleaming steel of Cloudgate and began walking back toward the financial district. The towering glass facades of the corporate headquarters loomed ahead, a concrete and steel canyon where I held undisputed authority. The journey from a struggling diner waitress to a commanding banking executive taught me a definitive, unshakable philosophy. True power does not come from family entitlement. It does not emanate from a prestigious degree funded by someone else's sacrifice, and it certainly does not belong to the person screaming the loudest in a dining room. True power is cultivated in the shadows. It comes from silent, diligent work while others are resting. It comes from mastering your emotions when the people you love attempt to weaponize your loyalty against you. Above all, true power stems from the ability to set unbreakable boundaries. It requires the courage to look at the people who expect you to function as their permanent safety net and politely decline the role. You cannot build an empire if you are constantly draining your own foundation to fill the cracks in someone else's hollow facade. You must learn to observe their panic without absorbing their crisis. You must learn to hold the receipts, keeping the undeniable proof of your own labor and their undeniable negligence ready to present when the time comes to collect. I built a beautiful, impenetrable life. I surrounded myself with colleagues who respected my intellect, friends who valued my time, and a quiet, unbothered peace that no suburban gossip could ever breach. The vault was closed, the ledger was balanced, and the debt was paid in full. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with family who only saw you as an ATM? Let me know in the comments below. And if you loved this story of quiet corporate karma, make sure you like this video and hit subscribe to join us for more incredible stories every week here on Morning Revenge. The architecture of consequence, a reflection on family and fabrication. We often believe that the foundation of the American family is built on unconditional love, but too often it is constructed on a fragile architecture of conditional expectations. The story of Vivian Thorn, a tale of cold, corporate execution and shattered prairie illusions, is not merely a drama about a defaulted commercial loan. It is a striking, uncomfortable mirror held up to the modern household, reflecting the quiet, devastating rot that occurs when parents value prestige over integrity. When we look past the glass towers of Chicago and the stark black ink on the foreclosure notices, we are forced to confront a deeply unsettling question about how we raise our children, what we teach them about responsibility, and the ultimate inescapable cost of toxic favoritism. In the traditional American ethos, we loudly celebrate the self-made individual. We preach the virtues of hard work, fairness, and personal accountability as the cornerstones of the American dream. Yet at the dinner table, these values are frequently and quietly abandoned in favor of comfortable delusions. For parents across America, Vivian's narrative serves as a stark, urgent warning regarding the dangers of uneven parenting. The parents in this story worshipped the aesthetic of success rather than the substance of character. They funded elite degrees and celebrated hollow milestones, meticulously shielding their son from the natural friction of reality. In doing so, they did not raise a resilient, capable man. They cultivated a fragile prince entirely incapable of surviving the winter of consequence. True family education within a traditional structure requires a bedrock of unwavering honesty and acute emotional awareness. Fairness in parenting does not mean identical financial treatment. It means holding every single child to the exact same standard of moral accountability. When parents constantly intervene to erase the consequences of a child's reckless actions, they are not demonstrating love. They are committing a profound act of emotional sabotage. They strip the child of the necessary character-building struggles that forge true independence. By expecting their diligent, overlooked daughter to empty her hard-earned life savings to fund her brother's vanity, they weaponize the sacred concept of family duty. The message to American parents is unequivocal. You cannot build a child's future by mortgaging another child's peace of mind. A functional family structure must be a sanctuary of truth, not a curated theater for performative success. For the young people navigating the daunting complexities of entering adulthood, Vivian's silent, unyielding assent imparts a revolutionary, empowering lesson. We are heavily conditioned from birth to believe that our worth is intrinsically tied to our family's validation and approval. Vivian shatters this outdated paradigm with breathtaking precision. Her journey teaches the youth that your bloodline is not a business plan, and familial guilt is a bankrupt currency. When the people meant to protect you choose to overlook your diligence in favor of someone else's charm, you must become your own fiercest advocate. True power is not granted by birthright. It is meticulously constructed in the quiet, unseen hours of grinding labor and relentless focus. Vivian teaches young adults that setting an impenetrable boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate necessary act of self-preservation. You are not obligated to serve as a human shield for someone else's dysfunction. You are allowed to walk away from the table, build your own towering empire, and lock the door behind you. Stepping back and viewing this narrative through the lens of a spiritual practitioner, the collapse of the Thorne family reveals a profound, timeless lesson in the art of self-cultivation. Modern society is heavily intoxicated by the superficial markers of worth, the leased luxury vehicles, the exclusive country club memberships, the desperate, hollow curation of online personas. This societal obsession with external validation starves the inner self, leaving the soul malnourished and brittle. From a spiritual perspective, true wealth is found only in the pursuit of wisdom, the adherence to morality, and the development of profound inner resilience. It is the steady, quiet cultivation of a spirit that remains unshaken when the external world inevitably burns. The brother Leo represents the ultimate spiritual tragedy of modern life. By living a life of perpetual deceit and surface-level vanity, he accumulated severe karmic debt, tying his entire existence to material illusions that could be wiped out with a single signature. His parents, by continuously enabling his delusions, became active co-conspirators in his spiritual stagnation. They denied him the friction required for authentic personal growth. In the spiritual realm, facing the direct consequences of one's actions is the greatest, most merciful teacher a person can encounter. When Vivian initiated the foreclosure proceedings, she was not merely acting as a ruthless banking executive. She manifested as an agent of universal balance. She stripped away the falsehoods, forcing her family to stand naked and vulnerable before their own choices. For parents seeking a higher, more mindful path, the spiritual mandate is clear. Guide your children toward unshakable inner fortitude. Teach them early and often that a life built on deceit will inevitably crumble, regardless of how beautifully it is decorated on the outside. Cultivate their moral compass with intention, so they do not rely on the fleeting applause of a prairie town or a social media feed to feel whole. True resilience is forged only when we step back and allow our children to fall, to feel the harsh, stinging scrape of the pavement, and to discover their own miraculous strength in the grueling act of rising again. As we navigate our own familial complexities, we must pause and ask ourselves which role we are currently playing in the lives of those we love. Are we funding a comfortable illusion, or are we building something real and enduring? Are we demanding unreasonable sacrifices from those we take for granted simply to preserve a lie we are too terrified to dismantle? If this reflection resonates with the silent battles you fight every day, and if you have ever had to draw a hard, unforgiving line to protect your own peace, I invite you to join our community. Hit subscribe and follow Morning Revenge for more stories that challenge the shadows of our everyday lives. Ultimately, we must reconsider the very definition of familial loyalty. We are taught from a young age that abandoning family is the greatest conceivable moral failing. But perhaps there is a deeper, more unsettling truth hidden beneath the polished mahogany of the boardroom table. Sometimes the most profound, authentic expression of love is not a warm embrace, but the cold, uncompromising destruction of someone's illusions. By refusing to catch them when they fall, you finally grant them the terrifying, necessary gift of gravity. In the end, the villain of the story is rarely the one who enforces the contract. The villain is the one who asked you to set yourself on fire just to keep their delusion warm.